One night, after 10 years of marriage, my husband decided to be honest. I'm in love with your sister. We've been together for 2 years. Hi, welcome to my channel. I invite you to listen to my new story. It all happened on a Wednesday evening in our own home after a decade of building a life together. My husband didn't sit next to me on the sofa like he usually did. He sat directly across from me, looked me dead in the eyes, and uttered those words, "I've loved your sister Alara for 2 years." He waited for me to fall to pieces, to completely shatter. But I didn't answer with a single word. I didn't react in any visible way. I simply stood up silently, picked up my phone, and made one call. In that exact moment, he had no idea that things had just spiraled completely out of his control. Thank you for being here. I truly appreciate it. Before we start this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your city or state in the comments below. Let's see how far these videos travel. A quick disclaimer up front, this story contains elements of fiction introduced for narrative and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or places is entirely coincidental, but the lessons you can draw from this are as real as it gets. In the life of every marriage, there are moments that brutally divide the timeline into a before and an after. My moment arrived on a Wednesday evening in April. The azaleas in the yard of our historic colonial home in Chevy Chase, Maryland, were still in full bloom, and on the surface, everything looked exactly as it should. I'm sitting on my porch now. It's well past midnight, and the mug of coffee in my hands went cold a good hour ago. The street is quiet. Chevy Chase at this hour always drowns in silence. You can only hear the distant hum of a car turning somewhere far down Connecticut Avenue. Occasionally, the muffled croaking of frogs echoes from the creek 2 blocks away, and from the darkness emerges the heavy, sweet scent of blooming azaleas. The Washington, D.C. area at night has a way of making the whole world feel like it's holding its breath. That April night, as I understand now, was exactly like that. My name is Althea. For 10 years, I was Althea Vance Sterling, though back then, I had no idea how high a price I was paying for that hyphenated name. I worked in D.C. as a senior forensic accountant and financial investigator for the FBI's white-collar crime division. It's the kind of job where you spend your entire day tracking money that someone tried very hard to hide or make vanish into thin air. My husband Calloway was a neurosurgeon at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda. More than a decade of grueling studies, an intense residency, and a reputation as a doctor, with an exceptionally steady hand and a decisive mind. A man whose peers called him a genius, and whose patients said he worked miracles. We had a beautiful, spacious home in one of the most wonderful and expensive zip codes in Maryland. We had a son, Thatcher, who was 10 and could already build incredible contraptions out of whatever he found in the garage. We had a 7-year-old daughter, Clementine, who had recently decided that green was the most important and only color worth acknowledging in the world. We also had Weston, our border collie, who at that moment was sleeping soundly in the corner of the living room, completely oblivious to the fact that the life he knew was about to be entirely reorganized. From the outside, we looked like a family that had perfectly cracked the code to happiness. I know this because people told us so at dinner parties, at the school pickup line, or at local neighborhood gatherings, which in Chevy Chase have their own unique, charming vibe. Everything just comes so easily to you two, we'd hear. I used to take it as a compliment. Today, I know it's just something people say when they have no clue what's lurking beneath a perfect surface. The warning signs had been there for 18 months. I can say that loud and clear now, with that specific hindsight a person only gains after the fact. But back then, I did what most of us do. I found rational explanations that fit the version of life I desperately wanted to keep intact. Calloway's phone always lying face down on the nightstand. Always taken into the bathroom, always an inch from his hand. I told myself he was just stressed about difficult cases in the ward. The late nights that stretched past 1:00 p.m., 1:00 p.m., and eventually midnight. Surgeries ran long. That was a fact, and I used that fact as a shield to cover up all the moments when the truth was entirely different. The growing distance between us wasn't dramatic or sudden. It wasn't the kind of coldness you could easily point a finger at. It was a slow withdrawal, like a tide receding so imperceptibly that you only realize how much the waterline has changed when you're standing on dry sand. I noticed it, but I didn't allow myself to name it. That Wednesday, Calloway got home around 8:00 p.m. I was sitting in the living room reviewing case files I'd brought from the bureau. Weston lifted his head when he heard the front door open, then rested it back on his paws. Thatcher and Clementine had been asleep for an hour. The house had that specific quiet that only descends on a home with kids after an enormous amount of effort. Calloway stood in the doorway for a brief moment, then sat down, not next to me on the sofa as he had done every evening for 10 years. He sat in the armchair across from me. It was a minor detail, but my body understood the signal long before my brain could process it. He looked at me for a long, heavy moment until he finally let it out. I love Ilara. This has been going on for 2 years. I'm telling you this because I can't hide it anymore. The room didn't change. That's the strangest thing I still think about. The lamp continued, casting the same warm light. Weston breathed steadily in the corner. From upstairs, I heard Thatcher shift in his sleep. The old floorboards creaked under the weight of a 10-year-old rolling over. The HVAC system hummed its monotonous, indifferent tune. Everything just kept going. The world didn't stop for a single second to acknowledge what had just happened in my living room. Ilara, my own sister. The woman who had stood in my kitchen for a decade of Thanksgivings, who had held both my children on the days we brought them home from the hospital. The same woman who just 6 weeks ago at Christmas dinner looked me dead in the eye and told me how much she loved me. That Ilara. 2 years. I set my coffee mug down on the side table. I looked at Calloway. I observed him very carefully, and in a fraction of a second, I realized something I hadn't expected at all. I didn't know this man. Certainly not this version of him sitting across from me with precisely prepared, rehearsed words and a look of sheer relief on his face. The expression of someone who had finally dropped a heavy burden he was dead tired of carrying. I knew some version of him, but not this one. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, a very specific kind of emotional stillness washed over me, which I now instantly recognize as the moment my forensic training quietly and unceremoniously seized full control of my brain. "Thank you for telling me," I said. My voice sounded completely flat and calm. I stood up, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled my coat off the hanger. Calloway was saying something behind me, but I don't remember what. My thoughts were already entirely focused on the phone in my hand, on the one single conversation I needed to have before I did anything else. I wasn't going to call Ilara. I wasn't going to call our mother, who probably would have picked up on the second ring, but whom I loved too much to drag into the hell I was about to walk through. I didn't call my best friend either, who would have shown up in 20 minutes with a bottle of wine, the best of intentions, and a warmth I simply couldn't afford to let in right then. I needed to make exactly one call, to the one person who would ask me exactly the questions I needed to hear. The call I made that night was my first move in a game Calloway had no idea had already begun. 20 minutes later, I was driving south, crossing the Potomac into Virginia, the tree canopy hanging low over the road like a curtain separating me from the rest of the world. I drove the way people drive, when their hands know the route by heart, while their mind is entirely somewhere else. I passed darkened storefronts, historic brick townhouses where a few solitary lights still burned, casting an amber glow on empty sidewalks. Old Town Alexandria at night can look like a painting. That Wednesday, I drove through it completely blind. Rowena lived in a narrow 3-story brick row house on Prince Street. It was one of those beautifully restored streets where the historic brick sidewalks are so old they've settled into a charming, uneven slope. She had been my closest friend for 11 years, and simultaneously, a highly sought-after family law attorney for 14. Those two facts had always existed separately in my mind. The friend and the lawyer, two different people who happened to share the same face. That night, for the first time, I needed them to merge into one. She opened the door before I even knocked. She looked at my face and didn't ask a single question about how I was feeling. That more than anything else assured me I had come to the right place. Her kitchen was warm and narrow, with high ceilings and a window looking out onto a small walled garden. She sat me at the table, turned on the kettle, and poured 2 mugs of chamomile tea, not even asking if I wanted one. Then she sat across from me, opened a fresh legal pad she'd already placed on the table, and asked a question that instantly yanked me back from the edge of the chaos I was slowly drifting into. "Do you have a joint brokerage account?" She didn't ask, "Are you okay?" Or, "I can't believe he did this to you." She didn't ask, "What are you going to do now?" She asked about a bank account. And that question, so damn specific, so practical, so completely unmoved by the emotional drama sitting in her kitchen chair, did more to ground me in reality than anything else could have. "Yes," I answered, checking savings and a joint investment account at Fidelity. "Who manages the Fidelity account?" I hesitated. "Calloway. He prints out quarterly summaries for me." Rowena wrote something down on her legal pad, not even looking up at me. I realized then that my hesitation, that half second of confronting the facts, was the kind of seismic shift that changes absolutely everything. I told her everything from the beginning, exactly as I would write an investigative report for a case file, chronological, factual, devoid of unnecessary emotions or personal commentary. Calloway's confession, the exact words he used, the way he sat across from me instead of next to me. Alara. 2 years. I watched Rowena take notes and refused to allow myself to feel anything that might disrupt the debriefing. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she asked me to describe my relationship with Alara. I thought about my sister the way you think about someone you've known so long. They've become an inextricable part of your internal landscape, not as an independent entity, but as a permanent fixture in your environment that you stop noticing because it's always been there. Alara was 34, I was 38. She was an interior designer, ran her own business, and lived in Charleston, South Carolina, about 8 hours down the coast. She divorced 2 years ago after a marriage that never really fell into place. She called often. She showed up for every holiday and always stayed a day longer than planned. She had opinions on my furniture, my kitchen renovation, and how I handled Thatcher's reading struggles in the 2nd grade. She always wanted things. That was the mildest way I could put it. There was always a certain kind of restlessness simmering inside Alara, which, for years, I treated as a character trait to be accepted, not analyzed. I remembered how, about 3 years ago, during a birthday dinner I threw for her at our house, she looked around the table at Callaway, the kids, our spacious colonial with its high ceilings and original crown molding, and said very quietly, almost to herself, "You've always had everything I ever wanted, Althea." At the time, I laughed it off. I assumed she meant a house, domestic stability, things that had always come easier to me than to her. Standing in Rowena's kitchen at 1:00 a.m., I realized how horrifyingly wrong I had been. Rowena pushed the legal pad toward me. She had written 3 words in capital letters, double underlined. "Document everything first. Do not touch the brokerage account," she said. "Do not transfer anything. Do not call Alara. Do not tell Callaway you've spoken to anyone." She leaned forward slightly. "You are a forensic financial investigator, Althea. You know exactly what a paper trail looks like, how it's created, how it's destroyed, and how it's found. Now you are going to build your own." Something stirred in my chest at those words. It wasn't relief. It was the feeling of a compass needle finally pointing north after hours of frantic spinning. We sat in that kitchen until almost 1:00 a.m. By the time Rowena walked me to the door, I had filled 3 columns in my own notebook: assets, risks, required actions. My handwriting was steady. My hands had stopped shaking somewhere around midnight, though I only just noticed it. The drive back was calm. I took the same route through the fog-draped streets of D.C., passing the same street lamps, but I was no longer the same woman who had driven the opposite direction an hour earlier. I thought about our joint Fidelity account. Callaway had mentioned the balance at a dinner party 18 months ago. He talked about a sum of over $500,000 with the easy confidence of a man who manages his family's finances well and knows it. He looked proud, and I had been proud of him. Tomorrow morning, I intended to log in for the first time in years and see what that number looked like in reality. I waited until Callaway's car pulled out of the driveway and disappeared around the corner. Then I made a cup of coffee. I had no intention of drinking, sat at the kitchen island with my laptop, and logged into the brokerage account for the first time in my 10-year marriage. The morning was already warm, the way April mornings in Maryland can be thick with golden light spilling through the old windows in diagonal beams, making everything look softer than it actually was. Thatcher and Clementine had left for school 40 minutes earlier with bouncing backpacks. Clementine still arguing that her green Converse were the only acceptable footwear for picture day. The house was peaceful. Weston curled up under the kitchen table right at my feet. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint mechanical noise of the city waking up outside. The login screen loaded. I typed in the credentials from a confidential document Callaway had set up years ago, the one stored in our shared home folder under a name so mundane. I had scrolled past it hundreds of times without ever opening it. The system loaded the account dashboard. Current balance $187,000. I sat in absolute stillness for exactly 3 minutes. I know it was 3 minutes because I stared at the digital clock on the microwave above the counter. The green numbers flipped once, twice, 3 times. While I stared at the figure on my computer screen, I let my brain do what it was trained to do. Don't react, don't interpret, don't feel, just process the raw data. 18 months ago at a dinner party at the Henderson's house in Chevy Chase, Callaway casually mentioned the state of our investments with the natural pride of a man enjoying his financial success. Over $500,000. He dropped the figure between the appetizer and the main course, like someone casually placing a trophy in the middle of the table. I remembered how he smiled when one of our friends whistled in admiration. I remembered thinking how much I loved that he wore his pride quietly, without flaunting it like a man who had built something truly lasting. The current balance was $187,000. Exactly $340,000 was missing. I opened a new tab in the browser and pulled the transaction history for the last 18 months. This was the part of the data most people in my situation wouldn't know how to read properly. But I wasn't most people. I spent my days at the bureau doing exactly this, poring over financial statements and finding the narrative someone had tried very hard to bury in a thicket of numbers. I know what natural market losses look like. I know what unauthorized transfers look like. I know the precise difference between an account that took a hit from a market dip and an account that has been deliberately and systematically drained. This account had been blatantly looted. The transfers weren't large. That was the first thing I noticed. And that piece of information immediately told me something crucial about the person who orchestrated this. Small sums ranging from $4,000 to $9,000 withdrawn at irregular intervals. They were spaced out cleverly enough not to trigger automatic warning mechanisms or currency transaction reports, CTRs, that financial institutions employ under anti-money laundering regulations. No single transaction would have raised a red flag at the bank. No single withdrawal would have caught my attention during a cursory monthly review if I had ever been invited to do one. However aggregated and spread over 18 months of careful, patient siphoning of cash, it added up to a massive $340,000. Money vanishing from the account that Calloway, with a smile on his face, assured me across a dinner table was steadily growing. This wasn't the amateur work of someone who didn't understand banking systems. This was the precise strategy of someone who knew the mechanics well enough to navigate them without leaving obvious footprints. I downloaded everything to my local drive. Every statement, every transaction history, every transfer confirmation, 47 pages of documents in total. Only then did I call Rowena. She picked up on the second ring, and without any preamble, I read her the numbers. She was silent for exactly 2 seconds. Buy a flash drive today. Pay in cash. Under no circumstances should you use your card. Go to a FedEx office or a local print shop downtown and print everything there. Do not use your home printer, and definitely do not use anything at work. After a brief pause, she added, "Do you understand why I understood perfectly? Modern home printers store a history of every process document in their memory. Meanwhile, a government agency printer maintains even more rigorous logs accessible by a wide chain of IT surveillance. I needed the paper trail I was currently building to exist exclusively in places where I had 100% physical control over it. It couldn't be linked to anything the opposing side could investigate or subpoena before I was fully ready. That afternoon, I drove to a print shop on K Street. I paid a few dollars in cash, stood at a self-service kiosk, and printed all 47 pages. Then I slid them into a plain cardboard folder I bought off a rack near the register. The entire operation took less than 20 minutes and left zero digital footprint tied to my name. At home, I hid the folder deep inside the closet in my home office, tucked behind binders labeled with official case file numbers on a shelf Calloway hadn't glanced at in 10 years of living together. Then I sat back at my desk trying to unravel the pattern I had uncovered in the transfers. $340,000, moved out in precise, perfectly calculated tranches. This meticulousness disturbed me far more than the sum itself. Calloway was a brilliant surgeon. Nobody who saw him at an operating table doubted that. But this kind of financial architecture required an entirely different skill set. Either someone taught him how to do it, or someone was doing it hand in hand with him. That distinction mattered immensely, and it was about to matter even more. I was still circling this thought when my phone rang at 3:15 p.m. It was Rowena. Her voice sounded different than it had that morning. It was slower, more measured. She used this tone whenever she had to deliver bad news and needed me to stay frosty before hearing words I definitely did not want to hear. Althea. A pause that carried real weight. You need to come to my office tomorrow morning. There's something you have to see with your own eyes. Another pause, shorter this time. Sit down before I say this. I found where the money was going. I sat down, and it's much worse than we thought, she added. I stared at the chandelier spinning lazily above the kitchen island. I thought about the green digits on the microwave clock. I thought about that dinner party in Chevy Chase and the man who smiled as if he had absolutely nothing to hide. I'll be there at 8:00 a.m., I said. The next morning, I drove to Rowena's office in Old Town Alexandria. I passed through the oldest parts of the D.C. metro area, passing green avenues, wrought iron fences, and historic brick buildings that had stood there long before our daily routines even took shape. It was a beautiful route. Normally, I loved the view. That morning, I barely registered it. I was accompanied by that specific kind of dread that surfaces when you subconsciously know the news is bad, but you walk toward it anyway, because the only thing worse than a painful truth is feeding yourself with ignorance. Rowena's firm was on the second floor of a restored colonial building near King Street. The waiting room was small, decorated with immense taste, a space that communicated professionalism and confidence without unnecessary flash. Her assistant gave me a nod and waved me through without a word. When I entered the corner office, Rowena was already sitting at the conference table. In front of her lay a row of documents arranged in perfect order, like someone who had been organizing her thoughts since dawn. She didn't offer coffee. She didn't ask how I slept. She pointed to the chair across from her and waited until I sat down. Then she started talking. The first document was a corporate registry filing from the Secretary of State, dated February 2023. The company name was Vance Design Partners, LLC. Listed as the sole managing member and registered agent Alara Vance. I stared at that name for a very long time. Vance was our maiden name, which Alara had started using as her professional brand after her divorce. She had formed an LLC, a company I had never heard of, which no one had ever mentioned to me, and whose existence I was completely oblivious to. Where did the transfers go, I asked, though the picture was already forming clearly in my head. Rowena placed the second document next to it. It was a bank statement history from the last 18 months. Every single transfer amounts ranging from $4,000 to $9,000 left our joint Fidelity account and went directly into the corporate checking account of Vance Design Partners, LLC. The withdrawals started in November 2022, just 2 months after the company was formally registered. They continued uninterrupted, as regular as a heartbeat up until 6 weeks ago. $340,000, transferred in baby steps to a company bearing my sister's name, a company created by all indications solely to catch that money. The transfer schematic I had analyzed the day before suddenly made perfect sense. The precise dosing of the sums, the irregular intervals, the amounts deliberately kept below the FinCEN reporting thresholds. This wasn't Callaway's logistics. Callaway was a surgeon. His precision was spatial manual honed over decades in operating rooms. Here I was dealing with an entirely different kind of exactitude. Someone who fundamentally understood financial and legal structures had designed this mechanism. Alara had been running her interior design business for 8 years. She knew invoicing, corporate accounts, and cash flow management. She knew exactly how to build the perfect vessel for money that didn't belong to her. I thought I had already absorbed the full weight of what was done to me. I was wrong. Rowena wasn't finished. She placed a third document on the table. It was a loan agreement. A home equity line of credit HELOC taken out against our house in Chevy Chase dated October 2023. Principal amount, $180,000. There was only one signature on the document. The deed to that house is in both our names, I said, my voice dropping unnaturally low. Tenancy by the entirety. The bank had to require both spouses' signatures. And here is how we bypassed that, Rowena replied, laying down a fourth document. It was a copy of a notarized durable power of attorney I had signed in the spring of 2020. I recognized it immediately. That year, I had been assigned to a special interagency federal task force in Miami. It was a long, complicated deployment. I spent 4 months down there. An absence that long generates significant logistical headaches when you own property and manage a joint household budget from afar. Callaway had suggested then that a broad power of attorney was a sensible preventative measure. Our notary prepared the document. I signed it without a shadow of hesitation. He was my husband after all. Trusting him to manage our joint life while I was gone was a decision I didn't second-guess for a millisecond. The document turned out to be a general durable power of attorney granting him the right to represent me in all financial and real estate matters. It had full legal standing, was open-ended, and didn't expire until I formally revoked it. It authorized Callaway to act on my behalf in any capacity related to finances and real estate transactions. Fully notarized, registered, completely legal. He used that document 3.5 years after it was signed to encumber our home with a second mortgage, without a word of commentary, without my knowledge. The bank accepted the paperwork because legally they had to. A properly drafted and unrevoked power of attorney is as binding to a financial institution as the client's physical presence. The loan officer processed it just like any other file by the book, clueless that the woman whose name was on the deed had no idea this credit line existed. I sat with that thought for a long time. The total sum arranged itself in my head without any need for a calculator. $340,000 from the brokerage account, $180,000 from the HELOC, a combined $520,000 erased from our joint financial life through patience, planning, and the blind trust I had given him over 10 years of marriage. I thought about how many times Calloway used to repeat a specific phrase. He'd drop it casually at dinners and passing conversations. Once, even in front of my own father. "I'll handle the finances. You just focus on your career." I took it as a sign of care. As partnership. A natural division of labor between two overworked professionals who trusted each other infinitely. In reality, it was the mechanism of my own destruction. "This stopped being a simple divorce based on adultery a long time ago," Rowena said. Her voice was controlled but hard. It was the tone she used when she needed her client to understand the situation rationally, not emotionally. The abuse of a power of attorney and the deliberate dissipation of marital assets to enrich a third party fulfills the criteria for criminal embezzlement of significant value. Calloway isn't just facing a civil case and a painful division of assets. He is looking at real criminal liability. This diametrically changes our strategy. I looked out the window. Above the rooftops of Alexandria against the April sky, the steeples of historic churches stood out, pale stone against the blue, the same view that had endured here for decades and would endure long after what was coming had passed. I thought of our porch of the garden with the azaleas that Thatcher had helped me plant 2 seasons ago. I remembered both of us in rain boots in the muddy chill of late February, as he asked questions about root depth with the incredible seriousness of a boy trying to understand how living organisms work. I thought about Clementine's room, which was still the wrong shade of green because she changed her mind 3 times and I kept putting off repainting it, promising myself I'd get to it eventually. And now they were going to lose that house. Regardless of what it would cost, how much effort it would require, or what the coming weeks and months would demand of me, that house had no right to become a bargaining chip on my end. But before I could fight for it, I had to return to reality. I had to go home, make dinner, help with homework, and be fully present for 2 children who had no idea their world was about to collapse. I had to cross the threshold of that house and act completely normal for as long as it was necessary. That was by far the hardest task. And it started today. You have to possess a very specific set of skills to sit across the breakfast table from the man who stole your future and still smile while pouring his coffee. I discovered that ability within myself at the end of that April. I had been training for it my entire marriage without even knowing it. Saturday morning arrived lazy and full of sun. Light spilled through the kitchen curtains as if it had nowhere to be. The jasmine growing outside the window had bloomed overnight, and the whole room smelled of something that used to give me pure happiness. I made toast, set the table, arranged the napkins, pressed my hand flat against the quartz countertop for exactly 4 seconds, then turned around with a spatula in my hand and said, "Good morning" to the man sitting at the far end of the island. Calloway looked up from his phone and set it face down, an old habit that now carried an entirely new meaning. "Morning," he replied. There was an exaggerated caution in his voice. It's how a person speaks when they are constantly rehearsing the narrative of their own innocence in their head. He watched every move I made between the counter, the stove, and the table with the hypervigilance of someone subconsciously waiting to be caught. "I know," I thought. "And you have absolutely no idea how much I know." I poured his coffee. I smiled. Thatcher came downstairs at 7:43 a.m., still in his DC. United soccer jersey, his hair plastered flat to one side of his head. He dropped into his chair and reached for the orange juice without looking, then suddenly froze. He looked at me, then at his father, then back at me. 10 years old. And he could already read the atmosphere in a room like a seasoned interrogator. "Is everything okay?" he asked. I touched his head, smoothing down a stubborn cowlick. "Of course, honey. Eat before it gets cold." He ate, but he didn't stop watching us. That's the thing nobody tells you about kids, how quickly they become little silent seismographs, registering every tremor that you swear you've perfectly hidden. Thatcher didn't ask anything else. He just ate his breakfast with the intense focus of a boy who on some wordless level had made the decision to remain on high alert. I loved him so fiercely in that moment that the emotion physically hurt. On Monday at 7:15 a.m., I was already at my desk. Our section at the bureau in the morning drowns in a specific institutional silence. It's the kind of quiet that smells like burnt breakroom coffee and filtered air, where the fluorescent lights buzz at a frequency just below the threshold of perception. For 9 years, I found that hum soothing a clean, task-oriented sound. I sat down, opened a file, and began my analysis. "This is what you do," I repeated to myself internally. "You work. You document. You don't let him see you bleed." I was halfway through an audit of a federal contractor when Imogen appeared at the edge of my cubicle partition holding a mug in one hand and a printout in the other. Got a minute. Imogen had occupied the adjacent desk for 4 years, meticulous with an incredibly dry sense of humor. The type of woman who notices absolutely everything while never giving the impression she's looking at all. She placed the printout face down on my desk, then slowly flipped it over. This came into the general tip line inbox this morning. The system flagged it automatically based on threat keywords, she said in a quiet, almost conversational tone. Your name is in it. I read the text. The message was anonymous. The language was veiled, very cautious, like someone who knew exactly how far they could push without crossing the legal boundary of a criminal threat. It alluded to a private matter, suggesting that my personal conduct might impact my professional career trajectory. It insinuated that certain private information regarding my personal life might prove extremely interesting to parties involved in the active investigations I was running at the Bureau. My hand didn't even twitch. I was proud of that. Internal protocol requires reporting this to the special agent in charge before end of day, Imogen said, watching my reaction closely. Even if it's garbage, especially if it looks like garbage. I know the procedures. I know you know. She hesitated. I'm just saying it out loud. I looked at her. There was no pity in her eyes. There was only that specific solidarity of someone who had made the decision to stand beside you without asking for the reasons. Thank you, I said simply. She nodded, took her coffee, and went back to her desk. I submitted the report at 4:52 p.m. SAC Silas Thorne received it, acknowledged it, and created a preliminary entry in the incident log. I watched him initial the form from across the bullpen. Procedure. Clean. Documented. Exactly as Rowena had instructed. Document everything first. That evening, Calloway called at 6:00 p.m. to say he'd be late. Sudden post-op complications, he claimed. His voice had the perfect structure of exhaustion, that professional medical fatigue, not the fatigue laced with guilt. I used to be unable to tell the difference. I made dinner for Thatcher and Clementine. I helped with homework. I ran bathwater. I read 2 chapters of a book in a voice that never once cracked. When the kids were finally asleep, I stood in the kitchen for a long time doing absolutely nothing, and that's when I smelled it. The scent was faint, subtle, trapped in the fabric of Calloway's jacket, hanging on the coat rack in the mudroom, a perfume I could almost name not mine. Something warmer with woodsy notes, the kind of fragrance you don't buy at a standard department store counter. The sensor in my brain, the one that had spent years tracking money through shell companies and offshore accounts, had already taken a digital snapshot of this information. The system would find a match eventually. Later, lying in bed with the heavy weight of Weston resting against my feet, I stared at the lazily spinning ceiling fan and thought about what Thatcher had asked at breakfast. Is everything okay? Not yet, buddy. But it will be. I was already 3 moves ahead. Calloway just had no idea the game had started. In my line of work, the best evidence is rarely what you desperately search for. It's the evidence that floats to the surface at the least expected moment, usually because people trying to hide something eventually just stop being careful. I came home from the backyard side entrance. The garage door was open. That was the first thing that didn't add up. Calloway had texted me at noon. Department head meeting is running long. Don't wait on dinner. His silver Audi was supposed to be parked in the Walter Reed staff lot until at least 7:00 p.m. Yet there it was, sitting in its spot. The engine was cold and the windshield was perfectly clean. I stopped in the threshold between the garage and the mudroom and froze. Something in the back of my mind shifted into absolute stillness. Exactly the same state that overtakes me when a number on a balance sheet refuses to reconcile with the rest of the documentation. It wasn't fear or panic. It was the cold, total attention of a woman whose job is to spot discrepancies. The house smelled of jasmine from the open kitchen window, and beneath that scent lingered something warmer, more woodsy. I already knew that perfume. I set my keys on the console table in the hallway without making a single sound and walked through the kitchen in my socks. Voices were coming from my home office at the end of the hall. It wasn't the television. I knew the difference by now. It was the specific texture of 2 people speaking quietly in a room they believed was entirely empty. A whisper, a pause, another quiet whisper. The rhythm of a conversation they had already had multiple times in multiple rooms in a house that belonged to someone else. I stopped at the edge of the hallway. Through the cracked door, I saw the corner of my own desk, the same one I brought from our very first apartment, with the scratch on the left corner from when Thatcher was 4, and ran his toy truck over it. Alara was sitting on it, not in the chair. On the desk itself, ankles crossed, acting as if she had an absolute unalienable right to be there. Calloway stood by the window with his arms crossed close enough to her that the space between them looked like a years-long habit. I pushed the door open. The silence that followed had a specific character. It wasn't a silence born of pure shock, though the shock was obviously there. It was the silence of final confirmation. The moment when a secret so painstakingly guarded by two pairs of hands is suddenly unceremoniously dropped on the floor. Alara looked at me first. For a fraction of a second, an entirely naked expression crossed her face. A flash of authentic emotion that might have been shame if it hadn't been swallowed so quickly. Then she lifted her chin and started to speak. Allie was an old childhood nickname. From summers at our grandparents' house, late-night talks, Christmas mornings, and every single moment she needed something from me. She grabbed for it like a key that used to fit a lock. She was still calculating. I saw it behind her eyes even then, searching for leverage for the next angle of attack. Alara had never in her life found herself in a room where she didn't know all the emergency exits. Alara, I cut her off before she could finish her sentence. My voice sounded flat, even as if correcting an obvious clerical error in a file. You need to leave immediately. She slid off the desk, picked up her purse, and walked past me in the doorway, close enough that the scent hit me with full clarity. The same warm, woodsy perfume I had cataloged 3 days ago on Calloway's jacket. She didn't touch me, she didn't say another word, but before she stepped fully into the hall, she looked back. Not at Calloway, at me. It was the look of a woman who was already deciding what her next move would be. Calloway's voice hit me before the front door even clicked shut. It's not what I dropped my keys onto the quartz countertop. A small, deliberate, and very distinct sound. I know exactly what it looks like, Calloway. I know. He stopped. Something shifted in his face. His entire prepared defense suddenly evaporated. And the meticulously constructed illusion of innocence was stripped of its foundation. He opened his mouth again, but I turned around and walked upstairs before he could force out a single syllable. I locked the bedroom door. I sat on the edge of the bed in total darkness and did not shed a single tear. Crying requires a certain emotional luxury, a belief that your feelings are the most important thing in the room at that moment. I couldn't afford that. I had exactly 2 hours. Thatcher and Clementine were at his mother's house in Bethesda. They were due back at 6:00 p.m. Those were 2 hours to stop the ceiling from spinning. 2 hours for the entire architecture of the life I had built with this man to settle into whatever shape I had to function within from now on. 2 hours before I had to go downstairs and be mom, the version of me who slices apples, asks about soccer practice, and reads bedtime stories in a steady voice that has no right to break. I listened as Calloway moved around the house below me. His footsteps in the hall, a long pause, right beneath my door, then the stairs, the slam of the front door, and finally the sound of his car backing out of the driveway, quickly drowned out by the constant hum of the DC. Suburbs. I pulled out my phone and texted one word to Rowena, confirmed. The reply came in less than 30 seconds. Good. Do not say another word to him today. We filed a petition on Wednesday. I placed my phone face up on the nightstand and leaned my head against the headboard. At the top of the stairs, the quiet click of Weston's claws on the hardwood echoed. He stopped right outside my door, turned in a circle, and lay down, leaning his entire body against the wood. 70 pounds of unconditional canine certainty that someone he loved was on the other side. I closed my eyes. 2 hours, I thought. Be their mother for 2 hours, and then when they fall asleep, become the woman who is going to win this war. I had confirmed what I needed. The rest was just a matter of paperwork. And nobody knew paperwork better than me. 2 weeks after that Wednesday evening in April, on a quiet May morning, while Calloway was 6 hours into a complex spinal surgery at Walter Reed and Thatcher and Clementine were at school, Rowena Linwood filed our petition for absolute divorce in the Montgomery County Circuit Court. Her corner office in Alexandria looked different in the morning. The light was softer right before the city surrendered to the afternoon heat, and the air became heavy and still. The documents were already on the conference table when I arrived. 3 sets perfectly aligned and marked with colored flags. It's the kind of precision that characterizes people with years of experience who know perfectly well that chaos feeds on ambiguity, and cases are lost purely through a lack of attention to detail. She handed me a pen, not some standard office ballpoint, but something heavier, black lacquer with a gold nib. An instrument you don't use to sign grocery receipts or school permission slips. Not to celebrate, she said before I could ask. Just for the beginning. I signed in 4 places. Althea Vance Sterling. Every letter placed deliberately. Every signature identical to the last. The pen glided without the slightest hesitation. I had made this decision 16 days ago in the darkness of my bedroom, while Weston slept against the door, and I hadn't questioned it once in those 2 weeks. Not in the shower at 6:00 a.m., not in the car line at school, not at 2:00 a.m., when the house went completely silent and there was nothing between me and my resolve but the ceiling. Rowena filed the documents through the electronic portal at 9:47 a.m., then immediately dispatched a process server to collect the physical copies. The server was instructed to find Calloway at exactly 2:00 p.m. The timing was premeditated right after his surgical block ended, but before his afternoon rounds, when Calloway would be sitting in the doctor's lounge, still in his green scrubs, phone in hand, slowly riding out the adrenaline wave of a successful procedure. That was the version of Calloway who believed the entire world worked in his favor. And that was the version who was going to hold that envelope in his hands. I thought about that perfect timing the entire drive back to the field office. He'll be at his most confident when he gets it crossed my mind. And a second later, he won't be. The call started at 2:15 p.m. I was at my desk at the FBI analyzing an audit of government contracts that had absolutely nothing to do with my personal life when my screen lit up for the first time. Calloway. I flipped the phone face down and went back to work. The spreadsheet had 63 line items. I verified each one, line by line. 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4, 9, 3, 4, 5. 5 missed calls in an hour and a half each forwarded to voicemail. Every time the screen went dark was a small, conscious decision on my part. I wasn't avoiding him out of fear. I was avoiding him because I had absolutely nothing to say that would benefit me in that moment. Rowena had made it extremely clear. Let the documents speak for you. Your voice will enter later, and solely through me. I finished the audit, forwarded it to my SAC, and at 5:30 p.m., headed home, driving through the shaded streets of Chevy Chase, focusing exclusively on the road. He walked into the house at 7:00 p.m. The kitchen was warm, the bright lights on. Clementine was upstairs practicing her reading, and Thatcher was sitting at the island with his math workbook, wearing that specific grimace that meant he had identified long division as a personal enemy. I was at the stove when I heard the heavy groan of the garage door opening. Calloway walked inside, pale as a ghost. It wasn't the pallor of illness or extreme exhaustion. It was the pallor of a man whose entire internal framework had just been subjected to a stress test he never in his wildest dreams anticipated. He dropped his keys on the granite counter, looked at the kids, then at me, and spoke in a voice he was desperately trying to keep leashed. "Can we talk?" Thatcher looked up from his math problems. Later, I said curtly, signaling I wasn't going to do this in front of them. Never in front of them. We moved deeper into the hallway where our voices wouldn't carry. His tone immediately dropped, growing tense. He sounded like a man trying to compress a massive, explosive charge into something manageable. "You went to a lawyer without a single word to me." During the 16 days of waiting, I had braced myself for many different versions of this conversation. A remorseful version where he breaks down and confesses everything, thinking I only know half the truth. A defensive version where he tries to frame the 18 months of transfers as an unfortunate financial misunderstanding. A begging version, which I thought was the most likely. I hadn't anticipated a self-righteous version. The voice of a man who genuinely considered himself wronged by the consequences of his own actions. The sheer audacity with which he delivered it was almost monumental in its structure. My voice remained perfectly calm and even. "You had a 2-year affair with my own sister," I said as if I were reading dry findings from a forensic accounting report devoid of any modulation or emotional backdrop. "You transferred $340,000 from our joint brokerage account into an LLC registered in her name. And you used a power of attorney I gave you in good faith while I was on federal deployment to encumber this house with an additional $180,000 mortgage without my knowledge or signature." I let a second of absolute silence fall between us. "What exactly, in your opinion, is left for us to discuss here?" He opened his mouth, but nothing coherent came out. I turned, walked back to the kitchen, and finished making dinner. He stood in the hallway for a moment longer, then disappeared up the stairs. He didn't come down to eat with us. By 9:00 p.m., he was gone. I didn't ask where he went. The family location sharing on his phone was still active. As he backed out of the driveway, I watched the blue dot on the map move steadily south, hitting I-95, eventually pausing miles away. He turned off his location sharing at 10:13 p.m. By that time, I had already taken a screenshot of the route, logged the timestamp, and dropped both files into my secured evidence folder. I texted Rowena. She replied a few minutes later. Elias Blackwood just formally entered his appearance as opposing counsel. Aggressive litigator, former federal prosecutor. It means they're scared and need time to move the pieces around. I looked up Blackwood. 12 years in private practice in D.C., after leaving the U.S. Attorney's Office. Known for procedural obstruction, burying courts in discovery motions, and running down the clock. The type of lawyer you hire when the client has massive assets to protect and needs the opposing side to lose their patience before a judge sees the full picture. I knew the strategy all too well. I saw identical patterns in white-collar fraud cases. Generate so much procedural noise that the truth drowns under the weight of cover letters. Let them move whatever pieces they want, I thought. I have the hard evidence. 3 days after filing the petition, an email arrived in my personal inbox from a temporary address. A random string of letters and numbers generated in a minute from any public terminal. The message consisted of exactly 3 sentences. You think you're the smartest person in the room. You always thought that. Let's see how smart you are when everyone finds out who you really are. I read it twice. The threat was precisely calculated, veiled enough that they could deny it in court, yet unambiguous enough in intent to leave no illusions. The work of someone who understood the boundaries of the law perfectly, someone operating under the dictation of a specialist. I immediately forwarded the message to Rowena, then saved it with a full timestamp to my secure folder. In 11 years of financial analysis, I've learned one fundamental rule. The first mistake is always the most expensive. It exposes the entire operational framework. It shows how terrified someone is, and how much they're willing to risk. They had just made their first mistake. That evening, at 9:00 p.m., I heard footsteps on the stairs. Thatcher appeared on the landing in his soccer jersey, his face expressing something he didn't quite have the words for yet. He was 10 already, carrying that specific burden of a child who subconsciously senses that the adults around him are barely managing. Is Dad not coming home tonight? I turned off the hallway light, walked up and sat next to him on the top step. The wood creaked under our weight. Down the hall, the pale orange glow of Clementine's nightlight bled through the crack under her door. I put my arm around him. He rested his head against mine without a word. We sat there for a long time. Neither of us spoke. The hardest moment in all of this wasn't the day I discovered the stolen bank transfers. It wasn't the moment I signed the divorce petition with that heavy black pen, nor watching Calloway's face when the court documents landed on his desk. The hardest part was this. A boy on the stairs in a soccer jersey, a question I couldn't answer for him yet, and a silence I could only fill in one way by being there next to him, without moving, without looking away. I've spent enough years around federal financial investigations to know what people reach for when backed against a wall. They grab the nearest weapon. For Calloway and his lawyer, that weapon was meant to be my career, and it was the worst possible choice they could have made. Another email arrived on Saturday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen island with coffee and case files when my personal phone buzzed. Same temporary inbox as 3 days prior. Same deliberate ambiguity dressed as blackmail. This time, however, the threat took a concrete shape. The case you ran in 2021, the Meridian government contract audit, contained irregularities you never reported. We have the documentation. If you don't withdraw the divorce petition, we will leak it to 3 national media outlets by the end of the week. 3 sentences. No signature. The grammar of someone who had thought it out carefully, or had been well instructed. I read it once. I forwarded it to Rowena, set my personal phone face down, and picked up my bureau-issued smartphone. Before 9:00 a.m., I was in the D.C. field office. Imogen was at her desk when I walked in. She looked at me, read my face in her specific way, and didn't say a word. I walked straight to Silas Thorne's office and knocked twice. I need to file an official report, I said. Attempted intimidation and unlawful interference with a federal employee in connection to an active civil proceeding. He pointed to the chair across from his desk. I sat down. I laid out the timeline just as I would present evidence to a U.S. attorney. The first email from 3 days ago already logged. And now, a direct threat to leak fabricated intel regarding a closed federal investigation unless I withdrew a legally filed divorce petition. Thorne listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded. You know what this is? Obstruction, potential witness tampering. Definitely in our wheelhouse, he added. I'm initiating internal protection protocols. You do not touch the IP trace. I know. I stood up. In this specific matter, I was now exclusively a victim. The Cyber Division traced the IP address via a federal subpoena the following Tuesday. I wasn't in the room when they did it. I was sitting at my desk, working exactly as I had every day for the last 2 weeks, calmly, systematically verifying fact after fact. Imogen walked up to my cubicle at 3:47 p.m. Thorne wants to see you, she said. Her voice was completely neutral, which told me absolutely everything. The digital footprint led investigators to a device registered on the administrative network of Elias Blackwood and Associates on K Street in Washington, D.C. It wasn't a personal phone. It was a corporate computer. The kind of digital trace left by someone who believes they can threaten people with impunity but completely miscalculated what happens when you target someone who works in a building professionally dedicated to hunting such things. Down. Thorne laid out the findings in 4 minutes. I thanked him, went back to my desk, and called Rowena from the underground parking garage. They didn't just threaten me, I said when she answered. They attempted to extort a federal agent during an active civil suit. A second of silence fell. This stopped being a family court matter a long time ago, she replied. We're talking about an entirely different category of felony. I know. I want you to retain the documentation. Don't file any motions on it yet. Let it sit as a bargaining chip. As leverage, I clarified. A bargaining chip implies an exchange. Leverage means they'll have to constantly wonder when the hammer is going to drop. She stayed quiet for a moment. You've done this before. I track dirty money for the government, I answered. So yes, I have. 2 days later, Rowena's investigative team dug up information that completely demolished my remaining understanding of the situation. She called me at 6:00 p.m. and asked if I was sitting down. I was standing in the kitchen looking out at the backyard, and I didn't sit. In November 2023, Calloway submitted a formal transfer request to a private neurosurgery clinic in Charleston, South Carolina, Rowena said. In December the same month, he was shopping with you for a new living room rug. He paid the deposit on a 2-bedroom luxury apartment near the Battery in Charleston. The lease agreement was issued to 2 names, Calloway Sterling and Alara Vance. I froze in absolute stillness. Rowena kept talking. Lease start date March 2024. 6-month lease with an option to extend. Utilities placed in Alara's name. I heard every word. Simultaneously, my brain rapidly calculated the dates. I had returned from the Miami Task Force deployment exactly 3 weeks earlier than originally planned. My official return date was supposed to be April 14th, but I came back on April 3rd. I had to reorganize my schedule because a witness deposition was suddenly moved up. Had I returned on the timeline Calloway expected, our accounts would have been bled dry. The second mortgage quietly consolidated, and I would have returned to a house my husband had already completely moved out of. I didn't discover anything. I simply showed up before he could finish his escape. Althea, Rowena said. I'm here. I hear you. My voice didn't waver for a second. Attach the lease agreement as Exhibit C. I set the phone on the counter. This was never an impulsive affair. Affairs can be chaotic, dictated by fleeting lust by proximity. This was a precise blueprint mapped out in November, funded throughout the summer with a specific zip code, a move-in date, and a listed roommate. I wasn't betrayed in a moment of weakness. I was being managed out like an inconvenient variable. The professional part of my brain, the part that spent days following the money to determine a suspect's intent, recognized the structure instantly. The private part of me needed a second longer to absorb it. My phone buzzed at 7:15 p.m. Alara Vance. I watched the screen light up once, twice, 3 times, then go dark. A minute later, it repeated. Finally, a text came through. Please, I just need 5 minutes. I turned the phone face down and started making dinner. 5 minutes of conversation wouldn't give her anything she wanted, and it would cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. The clean, documented distance between what I knew and what she thought I was willing to say out loud. Alara had spent her whole life mistaking my silence for weakness. This time she was going to find out just how wrong she was. She showed up on a Sunday evening, a week after we filed the petition, while Thatcher and Clementine were upstairs doing homework. She had clearly thought out her outfit. She looked remorseful. She had rehearsed that remorse down to the smallest detail, which are 2 very different things. I noticed her car before I saw her a graphite Volvo parked a house down, which meant she had calculated that too. Not directly in the driveway, close enough to walk up, but far enough to suggest she wasn't sure she'd be welcomed. On that point, she was absolutely right. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath and opened it. I didn't step back to let her in. I stood in the doorway, hand on the handle, and waited. Alara looked exactly as she always did when she needed something from someone. Focused, the sharp edges of her personality, smoothed out, retreated inward until the proper moment. She was wearing a gray linen dress. I understood the choice perfectly now. Her hair was down. She had foregone any jewelry, a detail I immediately logged as a conscious decision. Less armor means less of a threat. Alara understood costuming just like any other tool of manipulation. Hi, she said softly. I didn't say anything. She started with childhood memories. Our grandparents' house summers spent there when we were little. She talked about how we'd sleep in the same bed during thunderstorms because she was so terrified of lightning, and I would make up stories for her until she fell asleep. Then she smoothly transitioned to our mother, how devastated she'd be, how she loved us both, how this didn't have to destroy the whole family. Finally, she struck at the topic of the kids. It was the sharpest arrow in her quiver, and she knew it. Think about what a public court battle will do to them. To Thatcher, to Clementine. Think about Mom, Dad, everyone who loves this family. I'm listening, I said curtly. She expected me to interrupt her to cry, or to have that specific emotional breakdown that happens when you strike a sensitive spot with enough force. My absolute calm completely disrupted her rehearsed rhythm. I saw her trying to recover in real time. A slight shift in posture, a tightening at the corners of her mouth. She pushed through the monologue talking about the destruction a long trial brings, about how the documents would become public record, and how D.C. is a town with a very long memory for scandal. She talked about Thatcher's school, Calloway's standing at the hospital, things that brutally unravel at the seams and can't easily be stitched back together once you pull the thread. She spoke like that for about 4 minutes straight. I let her finish. Then her tone shifted. Blackwood thinks this can be settled amicably without going into discovery and evidence disclosure, she said, the warmth dropping from her voice by a few degrees. There are settlement options that would be fair to everyone. Dragging this out the way Rowena plans to will be horribly painful for all of us. Publicly painful. I appreciate the concern, I replied. Something twitched in her face. She hadn't expected that either. Allie. Her voice dropped lower, more predatory. The rehearsed role was cracking, revealing the hard foundation underneath, like bone under flaccid muscle. I know things about you, things you've told me over the last 23 years. The hard times you aren't proud of. Your fears, crises, secrets that would make certain people look at you very differently. A perfectly timed pause. I don't want to use that. I'm not threatening you. I'm just asking you to honestly reconsider if this fight is worth what it will cost everyone around you. 3 seconds. I learned about those 3 seconds of silence during interrogation technique training at Quantico. The silence that follows a threat or a declaration of intent long enough for the speaker to hear the weight of their own words, short enough that it doesn't escalate into open conflict. 3 seconds of absolute stillness. It works in interrogation rooms and during official depositions. As it turns out, it works equally well on a front porch in Chevy Chase. Alara heard herself during those 3 seconds. I saw the realization reflect on her face. It wasn't guilt. It was the specific discomfort of a person who said something out loud and knows they can't take it back. What you just described, I said when the countdown finished, meets the statutory definition of extortion and attempted witness intimidation in the context of an active civil proceeding. I'll optimistically assume you didn't mean to say that out loud. But Rowena will certainly want to hear about it. I tilted my head slightly. She documents absolutely everything. Alara opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. You should leave now, I said, using the exact same tone I use to end professional meetings when the constructive portion is over, and all that remains is unnecessary noise. She left. Her back was straight, her steps even. The walk of a woman suppressing massive rage through the hard discipline of someone who will never let you see her lose. She didn't look back. The Volvo pulled away from the curb smoothly without hesitation, without unnecessary drama. She had choreographed the exit too. I closed the door, stood in the hallway with my back pressed against it for a full minute and let myself feel it. Not anger. I had a specific place for anger. It had its own folder, case file number, and the cold, organized methodology of a financial analyst. What I let myself feel was pure grief and mourning. 23 years of a relationship, thunderstorms at Grandma's, midnight calls when our father had his first heart attack, the way she held Thatcher in the hospital the day he was born, this tiny, perfect, whimpering creature, and how she looked at me over his head with what looked like total boundless love. He's perfect, Allie. He's just perfect. She was telling the truth in that moment. I still believe that. The truth about what happened later didn't erase the prior years. It only altered the weight of everything they carried. I gave myself exactly 60 seconds. Then I straightened up, walked to the kitchen, and stood by the counter. I texted Rowena. Alara was here today. Veiled threat, attempted to use personal info as leverage. I maintained frame. Please log it. The reply came in under 2 minutes. Logged and documented. That is mistake number 3. They are panicking, Althea. Terrified people make infinitely more mistakes. I read the word 3 and stared at it for a moment. 3 mistakes in just 8 days. An email threat sent from the network of Blackwood's law firm. An IP trace our cyber division had already secured for the file. And now a visit that Rowena could easily characterize as attempted witness intimidation. Every move they made out of fear was a move I didn't have to make myself. Every mistake became another tab in Rowena's binder. I put my phone on the counter and looked out the window. The azaleas Thatcher had planted were in full bloom, stubborn bursts of pink against the dark soil. He picked that variety himself, consulting a gardening book he borrowed from the school library. He planted each bush with the specific, focused patience of a child who understands that some things take time. I thought about Alara driving back across the Potomac, replaying our conversation in her head, wondering where she went wrong. How many more mistakes will they make, I thought, before they run completely out of room to maneuver? Children absorb the emotions and frequencies adults emit perfectly, even when adults think they're hiding everything. Thatcher had been silent for 2 weeks. It wasn't withdrawal, but the specific quiet of a 10-year-old listening very carefully, waiting for the right moment to ask his question. It was a Tuesday evening in May, well past 10:00 p.m., and the light in his room was still on. I stopped in the doorway for a moment before he noticed I was there. He was sitting on the window seat, knees pulled to his chest, staring out at the dark yard. The azaleas he planted in February were just dark patches in the gloom, but he stared at them the way kids look at the world when they're trying to process something internal, not seeing what's right in front of them, but analyzing what they're carrying inside. I knocked softly on the open door. He turned his head. "Hey, buddy." He looked at me with that serious, focused face that sometimes painfully reminded me of my own reflection when I'm staring at case files and the numbers won't reconcile. "Mom," he said quietly, "did Dad hurt you?" I sat down on the floor right next to him, leaning my back against the wall, exactly how I used to sit when he was a toddler, and asked me to stay until he fell asleep. The hardwood was pleasantly cool through my jeans. Down the hall, Clementine's nightlight bled its warm orange glow. I wasn't going to lie to him. But I wasn't going to burden a 10-year-old with the weight of financial reports, shell companies, and HELOCs he couldn't possibly comprehend. "Dad and I are going through something very difficult right now," I said softly. "Adults sometimes hurt each other in ways that don't leave marks you can see. But you are safe. Clementine is safe. This house is safe." I looked at him intently. That is not going to change. He processed the information. Thatcher wasn't a kid who accepted the first answer just to close a topic. He turned the words over in his head, checked them from every angle, just like he did with everything. "Is that why you were crying last week?" he asked. I had no idea he had seen that. I kept my face entirely calm. "Yes," I answered truthfully. "That's exactly why." He nodded slowly as if filing the information into his internal index. Then he asked the next question. "Is Aunt Alara ever coming here again?" That question hit me much harder than I expected. Not because of the content, but because of what it implied. He must have heard something, noticed something. Pieced together the tiny fragments adults leave behind when they think nobody is watching. He knew Alara had been here. He knew we hadn't hugged in greeting. He added those facts to the rest of the pieces he had quietly gathered over the last 2 weeks. I didn't answer the question directly. I pulled him into a one-armed hug. And he let me. We just sat together by the window for a long time, looking out at the darkened yard. When I felt his breathing turn steady and calm, I said softly, "You don't have to solve all of this, Thatcher. That's what I'm here for. Your only job is to turn 11 in June and be absolutely terrible at long division." He let out a quiet sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a snort. Forced, but entirely genuine. "I'm not terrible at division," he muttered. "Last week you drove your math teacher to tears, and she was already having a bad day." I pressed my lips together so I wouldn't smile. "Go to sleep, buddy." Clementine ambushed me at breakfast the next morning. Still in her pajamas hair, a complete disaster, entirely free of the specific tension her older brother had been quietly metabolizing for 2 weeks. "Mom," she said, climbing into her chair and reaching for the maple syrup before her plate even hit the table. "Why is Dad sleeping in a different house now? 7 years old. Simple and direct as a compass needle. Sometimes adults need their own space to think things through." I answered, placing the French toast in front of her. She analyzed this information with the philosophical brevity available only to second graders. "Oh, like how I need the whole bathroom when I brush my hair. Exactly like that." "Okay," she summarized, then flooded her French toast with a massive amount of syrup, permanently closing the topic on her end. I stood by the counter, watching her eat, thinking about how incredibly fast children can build their own ground. They find the floor, plant their feet on it, and keep going. My only job was to make sure the floor under their feet never cracked. I called Rowena at 8:15 a.m. right after dropping the kids off. I need a specific clause in the custody agreement, I said without preamble. Alara Vance is not permitted to be present under any circumstances during Calloway's parenting time. No exceptions, no mechanisms for written consent. The clause must be absolute. A second of silence. I already drafted it, Rowena replied. I was just waiting for you to ask. I let out the breath I'd been holding in my chest for 3 days. Thank you. That was clean, hard, legal language, unassailable. That night when both kids were long asleep, I sat at the kitchen island but didn't open my laptop. I looked at the 2 mugs sitting on the shelf above the espresso machine. My cream-colored one with the chipped handle I'd had since college, and the dark blue one Calloway brought back from a medical conference 4 years ago and claimed as his own. They were both still there. I hadn't moved his mug. I wasn't quite sure what physically removing it from the space would mean yet. I let myself cry for about 5 minutes. I wasn't crying for Calloway. I wasn't crying for Alara or even for the lost money or the version of my life that turned out to be fiction. I cried because Thatcher looked at me with his wise, focused eyes and asked, "Did Dad hurt you?" And I hadn't been able to give him an answer that was both entirely true and simple. He deserved both. He deserved much better than the evasive words of a mother who couldn't give it to him straight. 5 minutes. Then I wiped my face, poured a glass of water, and stood by the sink. My phone on the island buzzed. "Calloway," I answered. Something inside me tensed immediately, then completely reoriented itself a second later. The voice I heard wasn't the voice of a man backed into a corner trying to defend himself or make demands. It was the other voice, the one I knew for 10 years before all this. The one that read bedtime stories on Sunday mornings and remembered how I took my coffee without asking. That voice, I thought, is far more dangerous than every defense attorney in Washington, D.C. I didn't say anything. I let him talk. I was prepared for his rage for Blackwood's procedural tricks for the entire litigation machine of a contested divorce to clash against everything I'd built over the last months. I hadn't anticipated how precisely he would try to play this. The call lasted 2 minutes. He didn't start with demands. He didn't mention Blackwood, the petition, or the federal investigation into the cyber threat his own lawyer's network had so unfortunately generated. He started with Thatcher. "He isn't sleeping, Althea," Calloway said, authentic deep concern bleeding through his voice. And that was the hardest part. I knew that tone. I had heard it for a decade, and I couldn't tell in that moment if what I was hearing was brilliant acting, or the real reflex of a father who, despite everything he'd done, still loved his son. "He told me last weekend that he lies awake. He says he doesn't want to tell you because he doesn't want to make things worse." I pressed my thumb against the edge of my phone case and stayed silent for a moment. "I know my children, Calloway." "I know you do." A pause. "That's not what I mean." And there lay the ultimate danger. That superficial softness was infinitely more dangerous than Blackwood's discovery motions, or Alara's manipulations, because on this one point, he was absolutely right. Thatcher really wasn't sleeping. I knew that from Tuesday night on the window seat, and the knowledge sat in my chest like a stone that wouldn't dissolve. Whoever Calloway had become in the legal filings in the Charleston apartment or in the financial audits, he remained the man who coached Thatcher's Saturday morning soccer team and knew without being reminded that Clementine needed her. Nightlight on even though she was 7. It was still the truth. It didn't erase his actions, but it existed. Then he moved very carefully to his actual proposal. He didn't ask to come back. He preempted my reaction before I could even answer a motion he hadn't formally filed yet. That preemption showed me clearly that this entire speech had been scripted in advance. I'm not asking for that. I'm just asking if we could sit down alone without lawyers hovering and talk about how to get through this, without turning it into total warfare. For Thatcher and Clementine's sake, maybe mediation, something quieter. I let the silence hold for exactly 2 seconds. "I will speak with Rowena," I said and hung up. Rowena's reply came before I even finished my morning coffee the next day. "He's doing this because Blackwood clearly laid out to him that the financial audit report is bulletproof, and the criminal risk for abusing the power of attorney is entirely real," she said, with the administrative precision of a woman who had calculated the scenario long before my call. "He's trying to establish a facade of good faith before we enter formal discovery. Do not mistake his litigation strategy for authentic remorse." "I'm not," I replied, though for a moment I really had hesitated. A brief pause. "It's human, Althea. A moment of hesitation isn't surrender. What did you tell him that I would consult with you?" "Good," That was the only correct answer. She waited a beat. Do you want me to reply to Blackwood directly, or do you prefer to close that door yourself? You close it, I said simply. The tulips arrived on Thursday. I was at my desk at the FBI field office reviewing transfer histories for a case when security at the front desk called to say a courier had left a package for me. I went down to the lobby and saw them on the counter. A massive bouquet of yellow tulips the color of early spring, wrapped in gray paper and tied with a white ribbon. Yellow tulips. My favorite since college. A fact I had mentioned to exactly one person in the last 15 years. The attached card was handwritten. I miss you. I know I have no right to say that. I stood and stared at the bouquet for 30 seconds. Then I picked it up and placed it dead center on the reception desk, turned outward, so it was perfectly visible to anyone entering the building, every agent walking past, and the security camera mounted right above the entrance. Then I went back to my desk. I logged the exact time of delivery, the florist's address printed on the paper, and the exact wording of the card into my evidence file. Imogen appeared at my cubicle 10 minutes later. She stopped at the edge of the partition, looked toward the lobby, and then at me. She didn't say a single word. She just gave a slow, single nod. The kind of nod you give someone who has just done something, requiring vastly more self-control than it might appear to an outsider. I turned back to my financial charts. Saturday morning in early June broke clear and bright with that specific mid-Atlantic air that smells of cut grass and the promise of impending heat. I was upstairs in the bedroom organizing my closet, not out of despair or nerves, but as part of that quiet, methodical sorting of things that gave me a sense of reclaiming my own living space. At 1:00 a.m., the doorbell rang. Before going downstairs, I looked out the bedroom window. Calloway was standing on the porch. Alara stood 2 steps behind him to his left, not quite with him, but not separate either. The way they stood had the geometry of a precisely directed stage position. He wore casual weekend clothes. She wore that gray linen dress again, her calculated costume. I stood by the window for a long time. Every trained professional instinct I possessed yelled, "Do not open that door. You have counsel." There is a specific procedure in place. You have a folder marked Exhibit C. You have an official report of attempted intimidation and hard evidence of embezzlement through abuse of a POA which qualifies as a felony. You have zero obligation to put your hand on that handle. But another instinct surfaced. Older, quieter, whispering something entirely different. You've been reading these documents for weeks. Let them speak in person one last time. See the full shape of what they've become. I walked downstairs. I put my hand on the doorknob. This isn't weakness, I thought internally. This isn't sentimentality. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do is let people show you exactly who they are. One final time, I opened the door. Before I tell you what happened when I opened that door, drop a "I'm still here" in the comments. Because what you're about to hear is the moment the masks dropped entirely. Quick reminder, this story contains fictional elements woven in for narrative purposes. The names, places, and details are adapted, but what this story leaves you with belongs to you. If this isn't for you, no problem. But if you're staying, don't blink. There is something incredibly theatrical about 2 people who have precisely choreographed their entrance. Calloway stood on my porch on that Saturday morning in June. Alara positioned exactly 2 steps behind him to his left. I realized immediately that I was facing a spectacle they had meticulously rehearsed together. I stepped back and let them inside. I didn't do it out of hesitation. I had simply decided 20 minutes earlier at the top of the stairs that the most useful thing to do was give them the space they needed to fully become whoever they already were. I had analyzed the dry documents for 6 weeks. It was time to let them speak live, so I could see the complete picture. I gestured toward the sofa. I took the armchair, the high-backed wing chair, by the window that put the morning light behind me, forcing anyone sitting across from me to squint slightly. A small advantage. An old habit from 11 years of conducting FBI interviews. You control the light, you control the room. They sat next to each other on the sofa, close but not touching. Exactly how people sit when they've pre-agreed not to manifest their connection, the precisely practiced distance of 2 actors who had planned not only their entrance, but their seating arrangement. I waited. Calloway started with Clementine. She was crying on Tuesday on the way to school, he threw out. His voice held that modulated concern of a man who knows exactly how to dose affection with surgical precision. He wasn't truly feeling it. He wasn't acting it poorly either. It was just perfectly calculated. I knew that. I know my children. I answered calmly. I am managing this process and their psychological well-being. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. I'm not saying they are. It was the same defensive technique I'd heard on the phone 2 weeks prior, word for word. He was running the same rehearsed script. I'm just saying there might be a way to get through this with less damage to everyone. Structured mediation outside the courtroom. Somewhere quieter. Rowena has already responded to Mr. Blackwood on this matter, I cut in. Through the proper official channels. A brief silence followed. His jaw twitched infinitesimally. It was a micro-expression, a flash lasting a fraction of a second, betraying a man whose prepared text had just been brutally bypassed by someone who had read right through it before he even arrived. He quickly regained his composure. He was genuinely good at this. That's when Alara joined the conversation, leaning slowly forward. No, Calloway snapped. One word. No elaboration, no explanation, no softening of the tone. She heard it and leaned back against the sofa cushions. She decided to try an entirely different angle. Her voice immediately dropped to a register I recognized flawlessly. That confidential, intimate tone she'd used since we were teenagers whenever she needed to force something out of someone. Wanting that person to feel special for being her confidant. A voice that had worked reliably on me for 23 years. I didn't come here for him, she said quietly, making a small gesture with her hand toward Calloway. The movement was simultaneously dismissive and intimate the way only a woman feigning distance from a man to manifest her actual closeness to him can pull off. I just want you to know what Blackwood is really planning. It's about the deposition strategy. They are prepping a line of questioning regarding your audits at the FBI, specifically the Meridian contract. I think it's a dirty play. I decided you needed to hear it from me. I looked at her without blinking. He plans to proudly argue that alleged irregularities in the Meridian report prove my professional negligence, which is supposed to undermine the credibility of my financial analyses in this divorce proceeding. He'll file the motion within 30 days, likely combining it with a demand to appoint an independent forensic auditor. That won't work because the Meridian audit underwent a full internal review and was closed as clean in November 2022, which Blackwood knows perfectly well. That is why it's merely procedural obstruction and running the clock, not a substantive argument. I paused briefly. Was there anything in this entire strategy that you thought I hadn't dismantled a long time ago? Alara was silent for exactly 2 seconds, and then her face changed. It wasn't the kind of change that happens when emotions build gradually like a slow tide. It changed the way a heavy door slams shut, violently, completely, and irreversibly. The entire rehearsed role dropped to the floor, and beneath it emerged something much older, something I'd seen in her before, and which was infinitely less careful. You always have to be the smartest person in the room, don't you? She spat. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict she had carried inside and collected for a very long time. Even now. After everything, you can't just let things be. You have to turn it all into a situation you've already won. I held her gaze, my expression completely unchanged. You had a 2-year affair with my husband, I said. My voice was exactly the one I used during official testimonies. Even factual, stripped of any emotional charge. You helped him funnel over $500,000 from our joint accounts through an LLC registered in your name. You exploited a power of attorney I gave him out of boundless trust to encumber this house with a second mortgage without my knowledge or signature. I let the silence resonate in the room, so forgive me if I treat this like a war. That specific, heavy silence fell over the room, the kind that appears when absolute truth is spoken in the presence of people who were not ready to receive it. Calloway reached out and placed his hand over Alara's. She pulled her hand back violently. Just a few inches, maybe less. A small, involuntary physical reflex before her mind could make any decision. He stared at his empty hand for a fraction of a second, before his face returned to a controlled expression. But I had spent 11 years analyzing the space between people, and what I saw in that fraction of a second was exactly what Rowena had mentioned 3 weeks ago in her kitchen in Alexandria. Terrified people make the most mistakes. They were starting to make them against each other. I'd like you both to leave now, I said. I stood up calmly, automatically ending the discussion the way I always end official interviews without unnecessary drama. Just definitively, your attorneys know how to reach mine. Neither of them said a word. Calloway stood up, first composed, still desperately trying to maintain the facade of a civilized man who had done everything in his power, and walked toward the hallway. Alara followed right behind him. The distance between them as they headed for the front door was noticeably wider than when they had sat on the sofa. I stood in the open doorway and watched them walk across the porch. Near the garden path, Alara hissed something under her breath. Not to me, but I caught the tone perfectly, even if I didn't catch the exact words. It was cold, sharp, full of grievance. Calloway answered her shortly, roughly, tossing out just a few clipped syllables. The passenger door of his car slammed shut with significantly more force than necessary. I locked the house, pressed my forehead against the cool painted wood, and stood there for exactly 3 seconds. Just 3. Letting the deep silence of the empty house wrap around me like water seeking its level. This door had been here since 1923. It had held up a long time. It would hold up a little longer. Then I straightened up, walked down the hall, and entered my office. The evidence folders lay exactly where I had left them, organized and labeled on my desk. I had reviewed them more times than I could count over the last 6 weeks. But the night before, while working late on our insurance documentation, the paperwork I had always handed over to Calloway without blinking because he was a doctor, and I trusted him implicitly to manage our medical and life insurance policies, I had stumbled across something. I saw a number in a very specific context, with a very specific date. I stared at it for a long time before closing the file and going to sleep. That number accompanied me through the night. The way digits haunt a person when they absolutely refuse to fit into any innocent, rational explanation. Some numbers, when you find them in the right context, stop being just a mathematical record. They become a massive question. And this specific question had only one coherent, logical answer. I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but I intended to call Rowena first thing Monday morning. Rowena called me herself the day after they left. She had found the insurance analysis in the investigative files I shared with her. She didn't say much over the phone. She just said briefly, "I want you to go to Deep Creek Lake this weekend. Take Opal up on her invitation. You need 4 days away from that house. And I need you to be thinking with absolute clarity when you get back." I drove out of D.C. on Friday morning before the Beltway even started to wake up. The route west into the Maryland mountains goes through rolling green terrain, stretches of forest and small towns most people have no idea exist. 3 hours alone with the road with nothing else to do but drive and think, which, depending on the personality of a woman in the middle of a divorce, is either the best or the worst medicine you can prescribe. It was the first time I had been authentically alone since April. Not the superficial solitude of an empty house where your husband's blue mug still sits on a shelf and the silence screams with the presence of other people. It was the solitude of the road of momentum, that specific freedom of a woman in a car driving somewhere with a clear intention and nobody guarding the door. I allowed myself that state for exactly 3 hours. Rowena called precisely as I was pulling into Opal's driveway. The house was a charming timber cabin located 2 blocks from the edge of the lake. Opal had come here every June for 8 years, ever since her own divorce, and started inviting me 3 years ago, repeating that I looked like a woman who desperately needed to remember what water and pine trees smelled like. She was right every time. I sat in the parked car and answered the call. Rowena's voice was exactly the same as always, even methodical. The voice of a person who knows perfectly well that maintaining professional detachment in difficult conversations is elementary to the job. She laid out exactly what she had found in the financial audit, doing so chronologically by the hierarchy of facts. In October 2023, Calloway initiated a formal verification process for your life insurance policy. Your existing coverage, a standard term life policy we've held jointly since your 3rd year of marriage, was modified. The death benefit was doubled to $2,000,000. The rider was processed and approved in the 2nd week of October 2023. Vance Design Partners LLC was registered in February 2023. The second mortgage on the Chevy Chase house was signed on the 31st of October, 2023. 3 documents, one and the same month. "I'm not drawing hasty conclusions," Rowena said calmly, "but you need to be aware of this." Silence fell over the line. We both lived in it. The question neither of us spoke out loud was exactly the same one that had haunted me the night before. The one I saw in the insurance docs and closed before bed, hoping it would look smaller in the morning. It didn't. In isolation from the other evidence, it's not enough to bring criminal charges of that nature, Rowena continued. But in a deposition protocol next to everything else, the Shell LLC, the POA abuse, the Charleston lease, the intimidation attempts, it diametrically changes the atmosphere in the room. It changes what a judge starts to picture. "Yes," I added quietly. "Yes," she confirmed. "Exactly that." I thanked her and sat in the car for another minute after the call ended, watching a bird glide low over the roofline, unhurried, entirely indifferent to everything happening beneath it. October 2023, I thought internally. He was already building his final emergency exit in October. That evening, Opal and I sat on the deck with a glass of wine, listening to the sound of the water in the darkness. Deep Creek Lake at night in June has something extraordinary about it. The wind off the water is warm but persistent, forcing conversations to become more honest than they would be inside a closed room. Opal had been strangely quiet since I arrived, which I immediately noticed and mentally catalogued. She poured me wine without asking. Then she set the bottle down and fixed her gaze on the dark surface of the lake. "Althea," she started quietly, "I need to tell you something. 8 months ago I saw them at a restaurant in Charleston. Calloway and Alara. They were together." I turned my head and looked at her. I didn't say a word. I learned through 11 years at the Bureau that the most important thing you can do when someone starts telling the truth is simply to wait in absolute silence. I told myself I wasn't sure what I was seeing, she continued nervously, turning the wine glass by the stem. They were just eating dinner right. I kept telling myself it wasn't my business, that you were happy. And then 3 days later, Alara called me. She described it very carefully in a manner characteristic of people who had replayed a scene in their heads countless times. Alara didn't threaten her. Nothing like that. She was warm, incredibly interested in her life, overly sweet, the version of Alara that appears like pure sunshine, until you notice exactly where the shadows fall. She casually mentioned a massive commercial interior design contract that would guarantee Opal's studio 6 months of solid profits and financial peace. And right in the middle of that conversation, draped in the cloak of friendly concern, she dropped it casually. "You know how complicated things can be. Althea has always been the strong one. She doesn't need people adding to her worries with things they aren't even sure about themselves." She didn't have to say anything directly. Opal added quietly. She was good enough at it that she didn't need open declarations. "Did you take the contract?" I asked shortly. "No." A pause. "But I kept quiet. I convinced myself I was protecting you." She looked directly at me, her eyes filling with tears in that specific way when a person is about to expel something that's been suffocating them for an agonizingly long time. I was scared, Althea, and Alara knew exactly how to use that fear. I stood up from the chair, walked to the deck railing, gripped it with both hands, and stared out at the dark water. 8 months. Opal. I didn't feel anger. In fact, I was struck by a complete absence of wrath, which surprised even me. What I felt was the massive, crushing weight of that number. 8 months during which I lived under the same roof as a man planning his escape. 8 months during which I stood next to Alara on Christmas, believing her warmth was authentic. 8 months during which my exit from this arrangement was being financed, structured, and stamped with a specific date. 8 months during which my close friend knew something was wrong and rationalized her own silence. Behind me, Opal didn't say anything. I only heard the quiet clink of her glass being set on the wooden table. We stood there for a long time with a vast body of water between us and everything that had just collapsed. The lake was completely uninterested in what people did to each other on its shores. It simply existed in steady motion. We drank our morning coffee on the same deck, watching the sun rise over the tree line in that characteristic slow way, without unnecessary drama, but inevitably, the light comes regardless of whether you're ready for it or not. We didn't talk about the night before. There were no words yet that could make that conversation useful. But before I packed my bag into the trunk to head back to DC, I stood in the driveway with my phone in my hand. My parents had been married for 41 years. My father spent 30 years as a federal judge for the U.S. District Court, and he believed absolutely that people owed each other the truth in a measure exactly proportional to how much they loved one another. I had been putting this conversation off for 6 weeks. You owe them the truth first, I thought, internally. You owe yourself the support of people who have known you your entire life. I hit the green call button. My parents built their life in Georgetown, the way they built everything. Carefully, purposefully, and with the expectation that the people they loved would act exactly the same way. Revealing the truth was the hardest conversation of that entire year. Not because they wouldn't believe me, I knew they would. I drove to their row house in Georgetown that same evening I returned from Maryland. The house I grew up in was a historic brick colonial on a quiet, tree-lined street. Not dripping with ostentatious luxury, but solid. The kind of building that over 60 years absorbs the specific habits of the family living inside and begins to smell like their very presence. My mother's garden in the back, my father's books visible through his study window from the street, the porch light always turned on after dusk, a rule since my sister and I were teenagers, which never stopped being enforced. I sat in my car in the driveway for exactly 2 minutes before I decided to go inside. My mother brewed tea, doing it exactly as she always did when she subconsciously sensed something serious approaching. We sat in the living room, the room where I used to do my homework and argue about curfews, The room where I watched my parents slowly age year by year while simultaneously believing in that naive, childish way that they would last forever. And then I told them everything. I started from the very beginning. Calloway's confession. On a Wednesday night in April. Alara. 2 years. The Fidelity account and $340,000 transferred through Vance Design Partners. I watched my mother's face harden when she heard the name. I mentally noted that she immediately understood whose name it was. The broad power of attorney. The second mortgage on the house. The lease in Charleston with Alara Vance listed as the roommate. I didn't try to soften the facts. They weren't people who needed a discounted version of reality. My mother started crying before I even finished. It wasn't the quiet, discreet crying of someone trying to control their emotions. It was the weeping of a woman whose entire internal worldview was being destroyed and reorganized in real time. She pressed her hand to her mouth, looked toward the window, and then back at me. And what I saw in her eyes wasn't pity for my fate. It was something much older and more complicated. How long has it been since I actually saw her, she forced out. She wasn't saying it to me. She was saying it to the empty space of the room. My father didn't say a single word. He sat in his wingback chair with that specific, absolute stillness of a man who had spent 30 years on the federal bench listening to the worst things people can do to one another. A man who learned that the first reaction to something monstrous and true should simply be full acceptance of the fact. His face betrayed absolutely nothing. His hands rested motionless on the armrests. When I finished speaking, he simply stood up and picked up his smartphone from the side table. "Alara," he said curtly when she answered. His voice sounded nothing like the tone he used during Sunday dinners, holidays, or Thatcher's birthdays. It was the other voice. I had heard it exactly once in my life when I was 17 and lied to him about something important. A voice you never forget. "Come to the house this week. We need to speak in person." She arrived on Tuesday. I wasn't there. My father asked me not to show up, which I took as both a form of protection and a tactical strategy. He called me that evening and recounted the entire meeting, and I reconstructed the scene in my head based on his words and what I knew perfectly well from Alara's playbook. She arrived in her soft version, the one that starts with profound remorse only to seamlessly transition a second later into building context. That it was all terribly complicated. That it happened gradually. That Calloway pursued the contact. That these things are never black and white. It was the same technique that had worked flawlessly in one way or another since she was 9, wriggling out of any situation by making the adult believe it was too nuanced for simple moral judgments. My father let her finish, and then he said shortly, "I am completely uninterested in who started it." He paused for a moment, and I could perfectly imagine the weight of that pause delivered secondhand. The heavy silence of a man who measured out seconds in a federal courtroom for 3 decades. He added, "I am interested in the fact that this man sat at my table every Christmas for 10 years. I am interested in the fact that he held Thatcher in his arms on the day that boy entered this family. I am interested in the fact that you knew about this for 2 years, and without blinking an eye, kept coming here. You let us love you while doing all of this behind our backs." My mother remained silent the entire time. She only stood up when Alara attempted to defend herself. In my entire life, I had seen my mother truly furious exactly twice. But this was something entirely different. This was the specific icy clarity that arrives when mourning ends and only pure facts remain on the battlefield. "You need to leave this house, Alara," my mother said shortly, "and do not come back until you understand what you did, not how it happened. Not what the circumstances were, but what you specifically did. You need to leave." Alara left. My father told me she didn't even try to argue. He mentioned that for the first time in his life, he saw her authentically terrified. And it wasn't fear of consequences or public humiliation. It was that specific dread of ultimately losing your roots, the realization that she had been seen right through by the people who had known her since her first seconds of life, and that by her own doing, she had become a complete stranger to them. He called me that evening at 9:00 p.m. His voice sounded much older and more fragile than it had that morning. Deep grief does that. It compresses years into hours when it falls upon a man who thought he had already seen absolutely everything in his courtroom. "Whatever you need from us," he said quietly. "Legal support, financial backing, regardless of the cost. We are here." I held the phone to my ear for a very long time after he hung up. The house was perfectly silent. The kids were asleep. Weston lay curled up at the foot of my bed, and outside the window the D.C. Jasmine was doing what it always did in June, smelling intense, heavy, and completely indifferent to human drama. Regardless of the cost, I thought to myself, we are here. I had no idea how desperately I needed to hear those words until they were spoken. Later that night, Opal sent me a screenshot. Alara had posted something on her social media profile. 3 sentences without naming any names. Precisely chosen, veiled language of someone who understood perfectly that an omission can be the most powerful form of accusation. It was more than enough. Anyone running in our shared social circles and in Washington, D.C., those old professional and social networks can be incredibly tight and interwoven, knew exactly who and what those words were aimed at. I stared at the screen for a moment. Washington has a very long memory. It's a city of old families and even older loyalties, where the same names rotate on foundation boards, law firm, letterheads, and alumni lists, where people remember exactly what values your father represented because they watched him on the federal bench for 30 years. Judge Thaddeus Vance didn't have to say a single word publicly. Alara had just declared a reputational war against him on his own turf. In every story about betrayal and lies, there is always someone who watched the entire operation from the inside. Someone who had every reason to speak up, and simultaneously 1,000 reasons to maintain absolute silence. History usually forgets them. But sometimes, when the right moment comes, those people decide to remember they have a voice. Rowena called me at 8:47 a.m. on Tuesday, which was entirely uncharacteristic of her. She was a woman who planned every minute of her life a week in advance. "Come to the office immediately," she said shortly. "There's someone here you need to meet." She didn't explain anything else. In the 9 weeks of our intense collaboration, I had learned that Rowena Linwood says exactly as much as is absolutely required, and not a syllable more, which meant if she omitted details, the omission was entirely intentional. I arrived before 9:30 a.m. The woman sitting in Rowena's conference room was in her 50s and carried that specific, cold confidence of someone who has made an uncompromising decision and already made peace with its consequences. She wore her Walter Reed Medical Center ID badge on a lanyard tucked deep under her blazer lapel. She didn't flaunt it, but she didn't hide it either. It was simply there. In front of her on the table sat a massive, thick binder bristling with colored tabs. "This is Odelia Davenport," Rowena introduced her. "Senior Coordinator of Medical Administration at Walter Reed. 12 years on staff." Odelia looked at me with an entirely steady gaze. "I want to tell you what I know," she began calmly. "And then I want to hand over what I brought with me." I sat across from her. "I'm listening." She had worked in Calloway's ward for 7 of those 12 years. During that time, Calloway had completely passed her over for promotion to a higher coordination role 3 times. Once throwing out a vague excuse twice without any commentary at all. He undermined the accuracy of her medical documentation directly in front of other doctors doing it in that specific, perfidious way, designed not to correct errors but to publicly diminish her competence. In official HR reviews, he described her as resistant to feedback, which in a closed hospital environment is precise coding used to effectively sideline someone without providing a formal cause. She didn't file an official grievance with the board. Instead, she began meticulously documenting facts. "I knew about the calls," she said calmly. "Calloway used the hospital's internal VoIP digital phone system to contact your sister instead of using his own smartphone. Staff personal phones have to be locked in lockers during medical procedures, but the internal system at the nurse's station and in the doctor's lounge is always available. He used it with absolute regularity." She paused for a moment, then explained before I could ask. "Every call made from a hospital internal line to an external number is automatically logged and recorded by the central VoIP exchange. It's an absolute requirement for federal security protocols and medical facility management standards. The hospital cannot disable this registry, and no single doctor can overwrite or delete those logs. The call records are stored in the administrative database for a minimum of 7 years." She looked at me with total calm. "As the senior coordinator of the administrative division, I have full legal access to the telecommunications billing history under my supervisory purview. I knew where to look for a very long time. I was just waiting for the moment I had compiled enough material for it to be actually useful." She pushed the first section of documentation toward me. 43 calls over a 14-month period. Directly from Calloway's hospital extension to Alara's personal cell phone. Dates, times, exact durations. Everything logged with the cold indifference of a digital system that records every fact without caring about its content. "The hotel reservations went through the hospital's travel and conference expense account," Odelia continued. Doctors with department head privileges use it to book hotels during medical symposiums. As a coordinator, I have full oversight of the facility's booking system. He used this account 4 times for entirely personal purposes. Charleston twice. Hilton Head twice. You'll find the invoices and booking confirmations under the second tab. The last section in the binder contained a legal document. An official copy of a civil court judgment from Raleigh, North Carolina, dated March 2019. Plaintiff Ryland Forsyth. Defendant Alara M. Vance. Cause of action civil suit for alienation of affection resulting in the dissolution of familial bonds and financial damages. Judgment ruled in favor of the plaintiff. I looked at the photograph attached to the case file. Alara with a completely different hairstyle in a different setting, but with the exact same unyielding, focused expression of someone calculating their next move on the chessboard. Another family. Other people who once boundlessly believed she was one of them. As far as I know, Odelia said quietly, this is the 4th time she's done this. Absolute silence filled the office. Why are you giving this to me? I asked directly. She didn't hesitate for a second. Because someone should have done this much earlier, she answered shortly. And because I am dead tired of pretending I don't see what's happening right in front of my eyes. It wasn't a complicated answer. In its raw simplicity, it was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in months. Rowena immediately began segregating the materials with bureaucratic efficiency. Virginia and Maryland don't recognize alienation of affection as a direct tort the way North Carolina does, she said, not looking up from the documents. We can't file that exact lawsuit against her directly here. But this finalized judgment from North Carolina is fully admissible as character evidence to support claims of a structured, repetitive behavioral pattern by the co-respondent in our civil divorce proceedings. This 2019 document clearly proves the existence of a continuous modus operandi across multiple relationships and state lines. During official depositions, a documented pattern like this carries massive weight. She pushed the files aside and looked me dead in the eyes. After the settlement or judgment is finalized, you could theoretically try to pursue a civil suit against Alara for intentional infliction of emotional distress, but that will drag the legal battle out for years. The decision is entirely yours. I thought about it for a brief moment. No, I said firmly. Rowena waited for elaboration. I want a full settlement on our terms. The house custody conditions full restitution of the embezzled funds. I want Thatcher and Clementine to have a mother who closes this chapter in 1 year, not 3. I took a short breath. Alara will generate her own consequences. People with her psychological makeup always do eventually. Rowena nodded in approval and returned to studying the binders. Meanwhile, the city started doing what Washington, D.C. does best in these situations. One of the department heads at Walter Reed quietly removed Callaway from the roster of a prestigious medical committee. 2 families from our Chevy Chase neighborhood stopped taking his calls. My father didn't have to say anything publicly. There was no need. 30 years of an impeccable reputation in the legal community ensures that silence, applied correctly, resonates infinitely louder than a flood of words. Rowena closed the last binder. We have absolutely everything we need, she summarized. The date for the deposition and official discovery hearings was set for Wednesday, July 3rd, exactly 1 week away. 1 week. I drove home passing the green traffic circles in D.C. and heading toward the Maryland line in the glow of the late afternoon. My head was still full of that photo from the North Carolina case file, that cold. Calculating look, that precise math, and that previous family destroyed before ours. I knew Alara only had one last move left to play. I had no idea what exactly it would be, but I had spent 11 years analyzing the decisions people make when they're backed into a blind alley. And I was certain of one thing. When a person panics, they don't reach for their best idea. They grab the one lying closest. Just 4 days before the scheduled deposition, Alara put her final card on the table. It wasn't a brilliant move. It was an act of pure desperation. And in my profession, I know perfectly well that the difference between those 2 concepts means absolutely everything. The official notification arrived via Rowena's firm on Friday afternoon. Elias Blackwood filed a formal motion. Alara Vance is 7 weeks pregnant. The motion declared that the father of the child was Callaway Sterling. On this basis, Blackwood demanded an immediate postponement of the depositions, scheduled for Wednesday, July 3rd, and a full revision of the settlement terms to account for future parental rights and child support obligations. Rowena called me at 4:15 p.m. and read the entire filing to me, maintaining her unwavering bureaucratic calm. I digested the information for a second. That is exactly, I said quietly, what a person does when they have run out of any actual arguments. Yes, Rowena confirmed. Exactly that. Callaway called 20 minutes later. In his voice, I heard a tone I had never heard from him before. It wasn't the rehearsed calm of the man delivering his confession on a Wednesday night in April. It wasn't the fake rationality of someone proposing amicable mediation over the phone in May. It was something entirely raw without any prepared script. I had no idea she was going to do this, he choked out. I believed him, which made the situation even more interesting. Not less. Talk to your lawyer, Calloway, I said curtly and ended the call. Rowena wasn't going to debate this motion. She immediately answered it. Within less than 48 hours, she filed a demand with the court for a mandatory, non-invasive prenatal paternity NIPP test, drawing fetal DNA from the mother's blood, a completely safe and clinically reliable procedure, available as early as the 7th week of pregnancy. Since Alara claimed to be 7 weeks along, the court could order the sample collection within the next 14 days without any detriment to the ongoing proceedings. Her brief was perfectly argued. She highlighted the fact that the issue of pregnancy had been introduced into an active divorce proceeding, where the division of marital assets and child custody were being actively disputed. Under Maryland family law, when the paternity of a child becomes critical to financial and custodial rulings, the court has full authority to order such evidence. She cited the relevant statutes. She referenced unified case law from the state Supreme Court. As Exhibit A, she attached Blackwood's own motion. Alara's response arrived 4 days later, via her attorney, and was full of arguments about the alleged health risks of early pregnancy stress, the right to privacy, and medical recommendations. It was the legal equivalent of a person tripping over their own shoelaces and spending half an hour explaining why they aren't actually lying on the ground. The judge analyzed both conflicting positions and issued an order exactly 10 days after Rowena's filing. All objections from the opposing side were overruled. The test was mandated by the court. A specific date was set at a certified clinical laboratory. Alara had no room left to maneuver. She had to show up. The results came in on a Thursday morning. Rowena called me directly at the bureau. I walked into the small conference room at the back of the bullpen, the one with frosted glass doors that signals to the entire floor that a conversation is strictly confidential. I closed the door and sat down. She read me the conclusion in one short sentence. Paternity of Calloway Sterling is excluded. 0%. I held the phone to my ear, staring at the frosted glass, and thought about the entire intricate architecture Alara had built around us. The 2-year affair, the Shell LLC, the secret HELOC, the lease in Charleston, and finally the pregnancy claim, thrown like a final defensive grenade 4 days before a deposition. Every single one of those elements was supposed to give them an advantage and a negotiating position. And instead, step by step, each one became an irrefutable piece of evidence against them. She just handed us everything on a silver platter, Rowena summarized briefly. Whatever shred of credibility Blackwood had before walking into that deposition room just ceased to exist. His client introduced a falsified claim of paternity into official court records. You don't walk out of a courtroom from that position. What does Calloway know? I asked quietly. Blackwood gave him the documents this morning. From what I hear, the conversation was exceptionally short and brutal. I imagined Calloway receiving that information. The man who had embezzled $340,000 for this woman, forged a power of attorney for a second mortgage, planned an escape to South Carolina, and reduced 10 years of his marriage to ashes. And she, at the exact same time, somewhere between one meetup and another in their 2-year affair, had been sleeping with someone else entirely. I thought about what that realization does to the human psyche, how it completely demolishes a person's understanding of the story they thought they were starring in. I didn't feel satisfaction. A much deeper, colder peace washed over me. That specific stillness that arrives when a massive, complex equation finally zeroes out. That same month, Alara's design studio lost 2 more major commercial contracts in the DC and Maryland area. I didn't check how the information was circulating among people. Information in an environment connected by decades of shared interests, acquaintances, and professional ties doesn't need a specific sender. It travels on its own once you set it in motion. At Walter Reed, Calloway's colleagues didn't say anything directly to his face. There was no need. 11 years of working in investigative structures taught me that the most effective form of professional and social ostracism is the meetings you suddenly stop getting invited to. The hallway conversations that fall silent the second you cross the threshold of the break room. The seat on a committee that is handed to someone else without a word of explanation. Calloway kept his job, but he lost what mattered most in that profession. The absolute trust of his peers. The rescheduled deposition was set for Wednesday in mid-July. On the morning it was to take place, I stood in front of my closet, much longer than usual. I had bought this suit in May. Navy blue wool classic. Single button. The exact same cut I wore for official testimonies in federal fraud cases. I hung it on the right side of the closet, completely separated from my daily work clothes, and waited. I put it on now and stood in front of the mirror. I didn't do it for show, not to manifest anything to the people who would be sitting in that room. Clothing in its most fundamental function is simply a form of maintaining integrity, a conscious decision to inhabit your own body in a completely controlled way, to show up as yourself, not as the victim the circumstances are trying to make you. That morning, I needed every resource I possessed, and this suit was one of them. I looked at my reflection for a fraction of a second. 10 years of married life was about to be deconstructed in a conference room on the 12th floor of an office building in downtown DC. Every wire transfer, every document, every logged VoIP call, every hotel invoice, and every paragraph of a power of attorney exploited without my knowledge. I was prepared. I had been preparing for this in one way or another since that Wednesday night in April when Calloway sat in the wrong chair. I was ready. I knew it as I adjusted the lapels of my jacket. I had been ready for weeks. It just finally fully hit me now. I grabbed my keys and went downstairs. I arrived first. I always arrive first. My father taught me that long before he became a judge and I became his daughter, who would one day have to use the lesson. Whoever controls the physical space controls the discussion. I sat at the conference table on the 12th floor of the glass building looking out at the DC skyline, waiting. The room held that specific silence that characterizes meeting rooms right before they turn into something else entirely. The court reporter sat at the edge of the table. Her equipment was fully set up, her face expressing absolute professional detachment. Pitchers of water, fresh legal pads at every chair. The entire space was arranged for the coming confrontation. Through the large window 2 blocks east, I could see the Washington Monument. Its sharp silhouette stood out clearly against the July sky. Calm, motionless, and unchanging in that specific way very old objects endure. I had passed it every day on my way to work for 9 years. That morning, I looked at it completely differently. I opened my briefcase and reviewed my notes one last time. I didn't need to. I knew them by heart. I was fully ready. Calloway and Blackwood entered the room at 9:12 a.m. I noticed Calloway's eyes immediately dart toward Rowena's materials. The massive organized stack of binders labeled color-coded commanding respect just by their sheer volume. It's the kind of documentation that delivers a message before the first page is even opened. Something twitched in his face. It wasn't the panic of a man surprised by a sudden plot twist. It was the final realization by a man of the full dimensions of the force standing across from him. Blackwood, to his credit, didn't show a thing. He pulled his documents from his briefcase, arranged them on the table with routine efficiency, and opened the proceeding with the full professionalism of a former federal prosecutor who had seen many difficult rooms in his life. He raised the argument of implied marital consent. He argued that the fact I had voluntarily ceded household financial management to Calloway for years constituted a de facto standing authorization to execute operations on the Fidelity brokerage account. The language was careful, the argumentation clean. He built the best possible line of defense from the materials he had, and I gave him my professional respect by listening to his argument to the very end without a single interruption. Then Rowena opened the first binder. She moved through the tabs without the slightest rush. It was a conscious strategy act, calmly, methodically, laying each subsequent document on the table with the quiet confidence of a person who doesn't need to fake drama because the facts speak for themselves. Tab 1. Fidelity brokerage account history for the last 18 months. Every transfer documented, dated, and precisely traced, $340,000, accounted for down to the penny. Tab 2. Vance Design Partners, LLC. Registration certificate. February 2023. Corporate account transaction history showing the direct inflow of cash from our joint investment account. Alara M. Vance, sole owner and registered agent. Tab Itch. The HELOC agreement for $180,000, executed on the 31st of October, 2023, against property held as tenants by the entirety, requiring signatures of both owners. The general durable power of attorney, signed in good faith in 2020, utilized without any prior notice or disclosure to the spouse. Under Maryland criminal law, the abuse of a power of attorney to embezzle funds constitutes a felony. At $180,000, the act vastly exceeded the threshold. The document itself was Exhibit A. Tab 4. The residential lease agreement in Charleston, South Carolina from December 2023. Tenants Calloway, Sterling, and Alara Vance. Lease start date March 2024. Tab 5. Odelia Davenport's documentation. 43 calls between Callaway's internal hospital extension and Alara's personal number over a 4-month period, logged by the automatic, non-erasable VoIP telecommunications system of the Federal Medical Facility. 4 personal hotel reservations, Charleston twice, Hilton Head twice, funded and expensed through the hospital's official departmental travel account. Tab 6. A certified copy of the judgment from the District Court in Raleigh, NC from 2019, Forsyth v. Vance. Civil suit for alienation of affection. Judgment in favor of the plaintiff against the defendant, Alara M. Vance. Documentary evidence demonstrating a structured, repetitive pattern of actions across multiple relationships over years. Tab 7. The life insurance policy modification. Doubling the death benefit to $2,000,000. Approval date the second week of October, 2023. Within the same timeline, the LLC registration and the signing of the HELOC on the 31st of October, 2023. 3 crucial documents. One and the same month. Tab 8. The official FBI Cyber Division Threat Report. Attempted intimidation and unlawful interference with a federal employee during an active civil proceeding. IP address location secured via federal subpoena and endpoint device operating on the administrative network of the law firm Elias Blackwood and Associates on K Street. Potential charges: obstruction of justice and extortion. Rowena placed the last folder in the center of the table and calmly folded her hands. Elias Blackwood immediately requested a recess. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I watched them standing in the hallway. Blackwood was speaking quickly. His gestures were hard, economical. The classic body language of a professional actively managing a crisis he didn't cause but for which he is now entirely responsible before a judge. Callaway stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes glued to the floor. The posture of a man whose entire internal reality was being brutally dismantled. They returned to the room after 7 minutes. Callaway looked directly at me, completely ignoring Rowena's presence. "This is exactly what you wanted," he said quietly. His voice was drained of any emotion. It sounded with that specific emptiness of a man who has run out of rehearsed roles and hit the absolute bottom of reality. "You wanted a reason to burn it all down." I looked at him for a moment. "You gave me every possible reason, Callaway," I answered calmly. "I simply used them." The court reporter's fingers tapped steadily on the keyboard. Blackwood sat down in his chair. "We are prepared to discuss a full settlement," he stated gruffly. The silence that followed those words had that good anticipated character. It meant that a certain horrific stage had just come to an end, and the terms of a new life were about to be definitively defined. The reporter logged the final exchange. Rowena leaned toward me and whispered very quietly, "He will give up everything." I looked out the window at the Washington Monument, unchangeably calm and pale against the July sky. I thought of our porch in Chevy Chase, of the garden Thatcher planted with me in the winter mud, of Clementine reaching for the syrup before her plate even touched the table. "Yes," I answered quietly. "He will." Settlement negotiations began that same afternoon. Blackwood opened his position and I listened, taking notes and not reacting in any way. Rowena replied briefly. The discussion in that room proceeded the way conversations always proceed when one side holds bulletproof evidence and the other faces massive criminal liability, precisely and strictly in one direction. There was one condition I absolutely refused to compromise on. It wasn't about the house, although I knew I was keeping it. It wasn't about the retirement accounts, though I was receiving half their value. It wasn't even about the exact restitution amount of the embezzled funds, though the sum of $520,000 was non-negotiable, and both sides knew it. The clause that mattered fundamentally to me concerned the 2 youngest people in this story. Whatever Blackwood put on the table, whatever concessions he presented as acts of good faith, that specific clause was untouchable. Some decisions have nothing to do with wanting to win. They have everything to do with what you intend to build on the ruins of the old world. Settlement negotiations are completely devoid of drama. They are conducted slowly, methodically, in the harsh language of statutes and subclauses, not human emotions. And that is exactly how it should look. I had used up my entire emotional payload just getting to that table. What I needed now was the hard letter of the law, and this time the law was 100% on my side. We met for 2 sessions. In the first, Rowena laid out our demands, clearly, completely without unnecessary theater. In the second, Blackwood offered subsequent concessions, doing so the way men concede when they know perfectly well that the alternative means total catastrophe. The house in Chevy Chase transfers entirely to Althea's ownership, with no equity buyout required to the husband. The sum of $520,000 as full restitution for financial damages from Callaway's personal assets payable within 60 days of signing the agreement. An unequal distribution of remaining marital assets accounting for the gross dissipation of funds by one spouse covering the $340 0 inches unauthorized brokerage transfers and the $180 000 HELOC. Every line item verified and confirmed by the forensic auditor. Non-negotiable terms for full physical and legal custody of Thatcher and Clementine to the mother. Callaway receives visitation rights every other weekend and one weeknight evening. For the first 90 days, pickup and drop-off of the children will occur in a neutral public location under third-party supervision. The general power of attorney is formally revoked with immediate and perpetual effect logged officially into the court records. And finally, that last clause, the one I carried in my heart since the night my son sat on the stairs and asked a question I couldn't give him a straight answer to. Elara Vance is not permitted to be present under any circumstances. At any location where Callaway is exercising his parenting time with the children. No exceptions, no provisions for future mutual consent. An absolute ban. Blackwood attempted to protest. I looked at him directly across the table. That clause stays, I said very quietly. Or, we immediately initiate criminal proceedings regarding extortion abuse of a power of attorney, and we hand the full financial audit over to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I waited a second. The computer from your firm's network is detailed under tab 8. I suspect your malpractice insurance provider will find that data incredibly fascinating. Blackwood was silent for a long moment, and then he initialed the subclause. I signed the final documents on a Thursday afternoon in mid-July. Rowena handed me the pen, the same black lacquer with the gold nib I had used for the petition 11 weeks earlier. For the culmination, she said quietly. Not for the end, but for the culmination. I signed my name in 4 places, perfectly identical every time. When I set the pen down on the table, the room filled with that specific silence that accompanies matters that have finally and definitively reached their conclusion. The consequences came in waves, just as real changes in life always do. In August, the administration at Walter Reed initiated an official internal disciplinary review regarding ethical violations by Callaway. Odelia Davenport's documentation. System VoIP logs. Hotel reservations. 7 years of quiet evidence gathering by a woman who knew where to look and patiently waited for her moment formed the foundation of that investigation. Callaway was suspended from duty pending a full review. He never returned to the surgical rotation. In September, I packed up our house in Chevy Chase. I put Thatcher, Clementine, and Weston in the car and drove west toward Virginia, toward Great Falls. Our new house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, right on the edge of the woods, with a yard sloping down toward the Potomac River. It was smaller than the Colonial in Maryland. 3 bedrooms, a sunroom, and a yard that required an enormous amount of work. Thatcher walked through every room twice, before deciding on the bedroom with the large window looking directly into the tree line. He stood by it for a long time in total silence, which meant the decision was final. Clementine picked her room in under 45 seconds and immediately asked if she could paint the walls green. I agreed without hesitation. She chose a specific shade from 17 swatches, with the incredible focused certainty of a 7-year-old who knows exactly what she wants before she can even define it. We painted those walls on a Saturday at the end of September. My mother brought lunch in Tupperware containers. My father carried heavy boxes without waiting for anyone to ask. We didn't mention the past year once. We talked about how the woods would look in the winter, whether Thatcher's new school had a good soccer program, and whether Clementine's green looked more like sage or emerald. She insisted with all her might that it was neither. It was just the right green, and we were all just looking at it wrong. It was the best afternoon I had experienced in years. In November, Sack Silas Thorne called me into his office. He had supervised our section for 6 years, a methodical, incredibly fair man. The type of leader who observes how people behave under extreme pressure and logs those conclusions in his memory, waiting for the moment they can inform personnel decisions. I watched you this entire year, Althea, he said, calmly looking down at his desk. How you handled this crisis confirmed everything I knew about your stress tolerance and your operational discipline under pressure. He slid an official letter toward me. Promotion to Supervisory Senior Investigative Analyst effective, December 1st. Thank you, I said briefly. He nodded and returned to his files. I sat at my desk and looked at that letter for a long time before putting it in my bag. I earned that title through 11 years of grueling service at the Bureau. The past year didn't give it to me. This year merely proved to me, and clearly to my boss, what kind of material I am made of when every single safe illusion is ripped out of my life. In March of the following year, the Maryland Board of Physicians received an anonymous tip. It was exceptionally detailed, precise. It contained specific incidents, dates, and descriptions of procedural violations, with the accuracy characteristic of someone who had personally participated in the described events. The digital footprint, when traced, led investigators to an IP registered in Charleston, South Carolina. Callaway's medical license was permanently and irrevocably revoked by the medical board. The ruling cited gross violations of medical ethics and the unauthorized exploitation of administrative facility privileges. Nobody in this story was surprised by where that tip actually came from: the woman who helped him build his emergency exit. The moment the money ran out, the escape plan collapsed and legal consequences came knocking on the door. She decided the entire catastrophe was exclusively his fault. People with Alara's psychological makeup always do that eventually. They are brilliant at escaping. They are infinitely worse at standing in the rubble they created themselves. It was a Thursday afternoon in March. I was sitting in our sunroom watching Thatcher and Clementine argue about the color of the river past the fence. He insisted it was blue. She swore it was green. The water, as it happened, wasn't either. It had that specific shade of the Potomac that changes entirely depending on the angle of the light, the time of day, and how thick the reeds are by the bank. I heard my son's rapid footsteps on the porch stairs before he even came into view. Mom, Thatcher said, clearly out of breath with the incredible seriousness of a child who is deemed an issue critical. Clementine says the water is green today, and I'm saying it's blue. Settle this. I looked at the river current for a moment. I think I answered quietly that it looks exactly like our water. He processed that answer with the same deep seriousness he brought to every sphere of his life. Then he spun on his heel and ran down the stairs to deliver my verdict to his sister. I drank my coffee, watching the light move across the surface of the water, and thought about the woman I was on that Wednesday evening in April, 11 months ago. The one who sat in Rowena's kitchen at 1:00 a.m. with a legal pad in her hand, a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. And about the woman I am now. The house was mine. The money had been returned. The kids were safe, arguing about colors on the grass out front. But the true distance, the real space between that kitchen table and this sunroom, between the woman whose hands trembled and the one who held a pen with absolute calm, that was my real victory. Not the settlement terms, not the promotion at work, not the one court case. That distance, my life had become quiet, fully mine, and entirely real. And that, as I had come to learn, means absolutely everything. People ask me sometimes what lesson I learned from this whole story. I learned that the most painful betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from those who know exactly where you keep your boundless trust and decide to ruthlessly cash it in. I learned that God doesn't remove the storm from your life. He simply teaches you how to stand in the dead center of it until the squall passes. And when it finally does, you realize you were stronger than the rain beating against you the entire time. I learned too late, and in the worst possible way, that love without documentation is, in the dark hours, just a fleeting feeling. And feelings, unlike forensic accounting reports, hold no weight in a court of law. So my advice to you is simple. Don't be like me. Don't wait 18 months to look at your own bank accounts. Don't naively assume betrayal always wears a stranger's face. Never confuse someone's silence with loyalty. And under no circumstances should you ever sign a power of attorney that doesn't have a hard expiration date. Retaliation against my own family wasn't something I consciously planned. It was a reality that arrived on its own, calmly, methodically, exactly the way justice tends to arrive when you stop chasing it and simply start gathering hard evidence. People imagine revenge as something loud, full of dramatic gestures. It isn't. The most powerful thing I ever did was my complete refusal to make any spectacular moves. I simply refused to look away from the painful truth. What I discovered is that true retaliation doesn't taste like a triumphant victory. It tastes like a Thursday afternoon in March in your sunroom watching your kids argue about the color of the water, knowing the house is yours, the accounts are settled. And the people who tried to erase you from reality are now living dead center in the consequences they built with their own hands. That is exactly what true victory looks like. And if this story was meant to teach me one ultimate truth about betrayal, it's this. Your intelligence is not arrogance. Use it. Your absolute calm is not weakness. Keep it. If any part of this story resonated with you, if you've had to face betrayal within your own family, or found your own quiet way through a storm, write about it in the comments. Share this video with someone who might really need to hear these words tonight. And if you want to be here when the next story begins, subscribe to the channel. It's already waiting for you. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. It means much more to me than you can imagine. One final note. Some of the stories that will appear in the future will contain fictional elements introduced for educational and narrative purposes. If that isn't the type of content you're looking for, I completely understand with zero judgment. Choose what serves you best. But if you're staying, I'm genuinely glad you're here. Thank you for your time today. See you in the next story.